I've loved you since the moment I saw you.
But I refuse to be his prize. I am your end, Damon.
Prologue. 1 year ago. Music danced across her skin as the pounding of the beat trailed down her body. It swayed with free will, beyond her control. Sweat clung to her skin, soaking through the tight red dress she wore. The material felt heavy and restrictive, yet still, Nova could not help but tip her head back and lose herself to the rhythm. Blood rushed to her ears, filling her mind with the thrill of the music, of freedom, of power. The atmosphere was heavy and hot, compelling in a way that made her stomach tighten with a deep, physical longing. She needed to forget the person who had broken her heart. A body bumped into her back. Nova stumbled, the trance breaking. Before she could fall, a strong hand wrapped around her elbow. His touch was searing, and her body seized immediately under the sudden heat. "Steady," the man said. Her breath caught. That voice. Nova swallowed hard, her pulse jumping. She had too much to drink, surely, because she could not explain the rush of attraction at the mere feel of his skin on her arm. "Sorry," she whispered, though she didn't want to move away. The man chuckled, a low, throaty sound. His hand glided up her arm, leaving a trail of goosebumps in its wake. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin of her neck like whispers of the night. An involuntary sound escaped her lips, lost in the roar of the club. The heat flared within her. She needed this. Needed to forget. His other hand settled firmly at her waist, drawing her back against him. Wisps of hair tickled her ear as his breath fanned her neck, and the delicate touch of his lips sent her mind spiraling. "What's your name?" His voice was a seductive murmur. "Nova," she breathed. They swayed together, the rest of the room blurring into a smear of neon lights. She was falling into his thrall, her body reacting to him with an intensity she had never known. "I like that," he groaned softly, trailing his lips along her jawline. "What's your name?" she dared to ask. She reached back, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. A low vibration rumbled through his chest and into her back, a sound that felt more like a growl than a hum. "Ever so curious," he murmured, his teeth grazing her collarbone. "Please," she whispered, her resolve melting. "Jaxon." Nova felt her body ignite at the sound. Jaxon spun her around, and her vision whirled. He was striking, tanned olive skin, dark hair, and eyes the color of molten silver. The intensity behind his gaze made her skin shiver. It was like a part of her soul just clicked into place, his scent, his touch, those piercing eyes. It was exhilarating. Nova wrapped her arms around his neck, needing to be closer, pulling his face down to hers. The glint in his eyes ignited her blood. Their breaths mingled, and Jaxon pressed his mouth firmly against hers. Nova couldn't think. She could only focus on the fire of the kiss as it deepened, consuming everything else. "Come with me," he said, his voice thick with a hunger that matched her own. He took her hand, pulling her through the crowd toward a door marked staff only. "I know the owner," he said, unlocking the door and ushering her into a private lounge. The door shut, cutting the music to a quiet buzz. Red velvet walls and leather couches bathed in magenta light surrounded them. Jackson's eyes were predatory as he watched her. Any hesitation Nova felt vanished. She wanted the fire. He moved with a sudden, fluid grace, pressing her back against the wall. His hands were warm and rough as they moved over her, his touch claiming. "What are you doing?" Nova panted, her fingers knotted in his dark hair. "I am going to take care of you," he whispered. The world dissolved into a blur of sensation. The scent of him, the strength of his arms, and a connection so fierce it felt ancient. Every nerve in her body buzzed with the energy he brought out in her. As the tension coiled tighter and tighter, she finally let go, her cries echoing in the quiet room as she called out his name. Nova clung to him, her nails scraping down his back as the intensity of the night peaked. Jaxon held her close, his breathing ragged, his teeth grazing the column of her throat before he finally pulled back. For a split second, his silver eyes seemed to flash with a strange, golden light. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. "Alpha," "We have an issue with one of the rooms," a man called from the hallway. "Alpha," Nova gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jackson's mouth parted, showing a glimpse of teeth that looked dangerously sharp. "Be right there," he shouted back. Nova stared at him, her mind racing with a new, terrifying confusion. Who, or what, had she just given herself to? Chapter 1. Nova couldn't tear her eyes away from Jackson's canines. They weren't human. They glistened with a sharp, threatening edge that made her pulse thunder against her ribs. Just moments ago, those teeth had been grazing the pulse point of her neck. She snapped her eyes up to his, her breath coming in shallow, ragged pants. The silver she had seen on the dance floor was gone, replaced by a terrifying, molten gold that seemed to glow from within. Jackson's chest rose and fell rapidly, his nostrils flaring as if he were catching a scent only he could track. "What are you?" she whispered. The question felt heavy, like a stone dropping into a dark well. She wondered if the answer would break what was left of her sanity. For a fleeting, panicked second, she wondered if she would even make it out of this lounge alive. Fear coiled around her heart and squeezed. "Alpha." The voice from the hallway was louder now, strained with urgency. Jackson's gaze flickered toward the door, his jaw tight. When he turned back to her, the golden hue in his eyes receded slightly, but the storm on his face remained. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against her cheek in a gesture that should have been tender, but Nova flinched. The heat of him was too much, it felt like a brand. He withdrew instantly, his expression darkening. "What are you?" she asked again, her voice gaining a sharp edge of desperation. He didn't answer. Instead, he set her on her feet. The sudden cold of the room hit her like a physical blow, and her knees buckled. Nova steadied herself against the velvet-covered wall, her eyes locked on him. He was watching her with a terrifyingly focused intensity, the way a wolf watches a deer. "Are you able to dress?" His voice was a low rumble, steady and calm, as if he dealt with world-shattering revelations every day. Nova forced herself to count to 10. She had to think. She had to survive. She nodded, her hands trembling as Jackson moved. He was a blur, moving with a speed that defied the laws of physics, gathering her things in seconds. He handed her the dress, his fingers brushing hers. That magnetic spark ignited again, a cruel reminder of the connection she had felt on the dance floor. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I don't believe you," she snapped, her eyes hardening. Life had taught her that men with power always used it to hurt. She had come here to forget her past, only to stumble into a nightmare that felt far more dangerous. Jackson took a step forward, his presence filling the room. "If I wanted to hurt you, Nova, you wouldn't have had the strength to stand." The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. "Don't," she gasped, holding up a hand. "Stay there." He stopped. He watched her dress with a pained sort of reluctance. Even through her terror, Nova felt the pull. The strange, unnatural craving to step back into his arms. It was a betrayal of her own senses. "I have to handle this," Jackson said, his voice strained as the knocking at the door became a rhythmic thud. "Stay here. I will be back to explain everything. I promise. Just wait for me." Nova nodded, though she didn't look at him. The moment the door clicked shut and the lock turned, the silence felt like a trap. She waited, counting the seconds, her heart a frantic bird in a cage. 15 minutes. That was all she gave him. She tested the door. Locked. "Bastard," she hissed. The panic flared again, hot and sharp. He had called her Alpha. He had locked her in. He was treating her like property. She thought of Elliot, the man who had broken her heart, and the familiar sting of betrayal fueled her anger. She wouldn't be a victim again. Using the skills she'd learned from a lifetime of being the small girl who had to be fast, she waited by the door. When it finally creaked open, she didn't wait for a greeting. She launched herself at the silhouette in the doorway, using his own momentum to knock him off balance. She didn't look back to see if it was Jaxon or one of his men. She just ran. Her bare feet slapped against the cold tile of the hallway. The music from the club was a dull roar in the distance. She burst through the back exit, the frigid night air hitting her lungs like a tonic. "Nova, stop." Jaxon's voice echoed behind her, no longer human. It was a roar that seemed to shake the very pavement. She reached the alleyway, her van visible 3 blocks away. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto her wrist. The heat was blinding. She spun, coming face to face with him. But he was changing. His skin seemed to ripple, his nails lengthening into dark, wicked claws. "Let me go," she screamed, tearing her arm away. The sharp points of his nails caught her skin, leaving a stinging line of red. "Listen to me," he growled, his voice vibrating with a power that made her want to drop to her knees. She didn't listen. She delivered a sharp, desperate strike to his midsection and took off, her feet stinging as they hit the gravel. She scrambled over a chain-link fence, her breath hitching in her chest, until she reached the side of her van. She fumbled for her keys, her fingers slick with sweat. The silence of the parking lot was deafening. It was too quiet. She climbed into the driver's seat, the engine groaning to life. Just as she slammed the door, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A massive, coal-black wolf stood in the center of the lot. He was huge, the size of a small horse, with shoulders bunched like granite. But it was the eyes that stopped her heart. Molten gold. Jaxon's eyes. The beast let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the windows of her van. It was a command, "Stay." Nova gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She looked at the wound on her arm, then back at the monster in the road. "Not today," she whispered. She floored the accelerator. The van roared, the tires spitting gravel as she swerved around the wolf. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. She didn't want to see him give chase. She only wanted the open road and the safety of a world that made sense. Chapter 2. 1 year ago. The moment the van's taillights vanished into the night, a crushing void opened in Jaxon's chest. It was a physical ache, a tether snapping that left his very soul frayed. His body, still caught between 2 worlds, began the process of the shift back to his human form. The air hummed with the release of ancient energy as his silhouette shifted under the moonlight, not a sound of breaking, but a symphony of transformation. He had never thought he'd lose his mate, not after the universe had finally seen fit to grant her to him. But she didn't know the truth. He had reached for her with the heart of a wolf, forgetting that she saw only a monster. That was his failure. Jaxon slumped to his knees, his skin cooling as a cold sweat broke out. He wanted to run, to chase the scent of pine and rain she left behind, but he forced himself to stay. He wouldn't hunt her like prey. Not Nova. The name felt like a brand upon his heart. From this moment on, every beat of that heart belonged to her, whether she was in his arms or leagues away. Lightning fractured the sky, and a sudden deluge of rain washed over the parking lot. His dark hair clung to his face, his body still thrumming with the lingering electricity of her touch. He could still feel her skin against his, a phantom sensation that made his jaw ache with longing. "Damn it!" He roared, his voice fracturing against the thunder. He struck the gravel, the sound lost in the downpour. "Alpha." He ignored the call, lost in the wreckage of his first night with his mate. "Alpha." A steady hand landed on his shoulder. Jaxon recoiled instinctively, his eyes still flashing gold before they settled back into silver. He didn't care that Colt, his second in command, saw him in this state. He didn't care that his pack saw his vulnerability. He had let their Luna slip through his fingers. "We will find her, Alpha," Colt said, his voice grounded and sincere. Behind the words was a hidden streak of worry. The pack knew that an alpha without his mate was a flame without oxygen. Eventually, the fire would go out. "She fled from me, Colt," Jaxon said, his voice barely a whisper. "She looked at me and saw a nightmare." "She will return," a gentler voice interrupted. Piper stepped forward, her pale skin glowing like parchment in the rain. "The bond is moving within her now. By the next full moon, her spirit will begin to change. Without your presence to stabilize that power, she will feel the weight of the transition. It is a pull no one can ignore for long." Jaxon looked at Piper, his expression grim. "But she doesn't know what we are." She thinks she's escaping a madman, not her destiny. Piper offered a sad, knowing smile. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch calming the static in his veins. Perhaps her mind doesn't know, but her blood does. The bond is more ancient than her fear. Trust in the moon, Jaxon. You will be reunited. Jaxon gazed up at the obscured moon, the rain masking the tracks of his grief. He had been given a soul-deep connection, and in his pride, he had nearly broken it. I hope you're right, he murmured, his voice lost to the wind. Because I don't think I can survive a year without her. Chapter 3. Present day. The moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, warping and stretching as Nova dragged a heavy dresser across the floorboards. The apartment was a transient shell, bare walls, a single mattress, and the lingering scent of dust. It was the third place she'd rented this year. Safety was a luxury she couldn't afford, and permanence was a death sentence. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she shoved the coffee table against the front door, wedging it tight. It was a psychological barrier more than a physical one. She knew that if he truly wanted to get in, a piece of furniture wouldn't stop him. Her gaze drifted to the balcony. The full moon hung in the sky like a giant, watchful eye, singing a low, silver frequency that vibrated in her very marrow. It was a celestial magnet, pulling at the dormant power Jaxon had sparked within her. For 12 months, she had resisted that call. Every muscle in her body screamed to run toward him, to surrender to the bond and find peace, but her mind remained a fortress of defiance. She caught her reflection in the darkened window. Her hair, once a flowing mane, was now a jagged, shoulder-length bob, a practical armor for a woman who spent her nights in transit. Her eyes were already beginning to change, the pupils dilating until they were pools of shimmering mercury. I am not his, she whispered, her voice cracking in the empty room. I am not a monster. The clock on the stove ticked toward 11. Nova stripped off her clammy clothes, her skin prickling as if 1,000 needles were pressing against her pores. As the hour struck, the air in the room seemed to ignite. The ordeal began not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing simmer. Her blood felt like it had been replaced with molten lead. Because she refused to complete the shift, refused to let the wolf take over without its alpha present. Her body became a battlefield. The power coiled in her limbs, seeking an exit that wasn't there. She lunged for the stereo, cranking the volume until the walls shook with heavy bass. It was a desperate veil to hide her struggle from the world. The heat intensified. She felt the phantom sensation of Jaxon's touch, a memory of his hand on her neck that felt as real as the floor beneath her. It was the bond trying to bridge the gap, offering her a way out of the pain if she would only stop running. She ground her teeth, the pressure in her jaw feeling like it would shatter bone. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. For 6 hours, she endured the unendurable. Every time her body tried to reshape itself into the creature she feared, she willed it back, forcing the power down with sheer, stubborn hatred. She used the memory of his golden eyes not as a comfort, but as a reminder of the man who had stolen her choice. The morning after. By 7:00 a.m., the moon had set, leaving Nova a hollowed-out version of herself. She moved with the stiff, deliberate grace of someone who had survived a wreck. She packed her duffel bag in 3 minutes. Habit was her only friend now. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, pulling the hood of her black sweatshirt low. The city was waking up, but Nova was already on high alert. Her senses, sharpened by the night's agony, picked up the scent before she even reached the corner. Pine, damp earth, and wood smoke. Nova reached into her pocket, checking her burner phone. 7:28 a.m. They were early. 5 of them, fanning out through the downtown district like a pack of hounds on a scent trail. These weren't just men, they were Jaxon's elite, the scouts who had tracked her through 3 states and a dozen cities. She ducked into a local diner, the bell above the door ringing like a funeral knell. She didn't look back. She could feel their eyes on the back of her neck. A cold, predatory wait. Restroom, she asked the waitress, sliding a $5 bill across the counter. The woman pointed vaguely toward the back. Nova didn't walk, she glided, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Inside the restroom, she moved with surgical precision. She grabbed a bottle of industrial bleach from the supply closet, splashing it across the floor and the base of the door. The sharp, acrid scent would blind their heightened senses for just long enough. She scrambled onto the top of a stall, her fingers catching the edge of a small, frosted window. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she jammed her pocket knife into the latch, prying the frame loose until it groaned. "Nova," a voice boomed from the other side of the restroom door. It wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of a predator. "The Alpha is tired of this game. Come out, and we can make this easy." "Tell your Alpha his game just got a lot harder," Nova muttered to herself. She ripped the window frame free and hoisted herself up, the jagged edges of the brick scraping her palms. She didn't feel the pain. She only felt the pull of the open air. Going up, she called out as the restroom door was kicked off its hinges. She tumbled through the narrow opening, landing hard on the lid of a dumpster in the alleyway. She didn't wait to see who was looking through the gap. She hit the pavement running, her boots skidding on the wet asphalt as she dove into the maze of back alleys and side streets. Behind her, she heard a frustrated, inhuman roar that echoed off the brick walls. She didn't slow down until she saw her new van parked 2 blocks away. Jaxon might be the alpha of his pack, but in this city, Nova was the ghost he couldn't catch. She climbed into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a triumphant roar. She had survived another moon. She was still free. And as she merged onto the highway, she knew the hunt was only beginning. Chapter 4. Present day. The air inside the gas station was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cheap lavender perfume. Nova stood in line, her dark sunglasses hiding eyes that were still sensitive from the full moon's light. In front of her, an elderly woman was flailing her arms, a hot pink nail pointed inches from the face of a teenage cashier. "I told you, mister," the woman shrilled, her voice grating on Nova's raw nerves. "The manager said my next fill-up was on the house." Nova took a step back, her nostrils flaring. The woman smelled of whiskey and old resentment. Normally, Nova would have ignored it, but her heightened senses turned every smell into a physical assault. She tapped her foot, watching the clock. It was past 5 p.m. In this part of the country, autumn meant the sun dropped like a stone, and she needed to be behind a locked door before the shadows grew long. Her gaze drifted to the small TV bolted to the corner ceiling. A news report flickered through the static. National wildlife specialists are calling for an emergency curfew in several counties, the reporter warned, her face grim. Sightings of massive, unidentified wolves are rising. While no attacks have been reported, officials are warning residents that these predators are displaying unusual, calculated behavior. Stay indoors after sunset. Nova felt a cold hand wrap around her heart. Calculated. They weren't just wolves. They were a pack on a mission. She hadn't seen a silver eye or a golden coat in 4 months, but she knew they were there, a silent, persistent shadow at her back. "Cash or card?" the cashier asked, his voice snapping her back to the present as the angry woman stormed out. "Cash," Nova whispered, sliding a $50 bill across the counter. "Do you know of a motel nearby?" "Somewhere, quiet." The boy looked at her with a mix of pity and suspicion. "The nearest motel is 20 miles down the road. But if you're looking for quiet, there's an old farmhouse 9 miles past the abandoned junction. Owners couldn't sell it. It's a wreck, but it's hidden from the main road." Nova memorized the directions. A motel meant a paper trail. An abandoned house meant a chance to disappear. By 5:44 p.m., the sky was a bruised purple, leaking cold rain. Nova pulled up to the farmhouse. It was a skeletal thing, gray and peeling, surrounded by miles of dense, whispering forest. She checked the rooms with practiced, lethal efficiency. She chose a back bedroom, one that offered a clear view of the woods, but kept her silhouette hidden from any prying eyes. She ate a dry sandwich in the dark, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. She missed the city noise. Silence in the woods wasn't peace, it was a warning. Exhaustion eventually won, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. Jaxon was there, behind her eyelids. He was always there. In her dreams, he wasn't a monster. He was the man from the lounge, his voice a low vibration that promised a home she no longer believed in. Snap. Nova bolted upright. Her heart was a drum in her chest. The rain had turned into a full-blown storm, thunder rattling the window panes. Crunch. It was the sound of a heavy weight on wet leaves. Not an animal. An animal would be silent. This was a message. Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the backyard in a brilliant, strobe light flash. For a fraction of a second, she saw him. A massive, coal-black wolf stood at the edge of the tree line. His head was low, his shoulders bunched like granite, and his eyes, even in the darkness, burned with a molten, golden fire. No, Nova breathed. She didn't wait. She grabbed her duffel bag and dove for the hallway just as the glass in the kitchen shattered. The sound of heavy paws hitting the floorboards echoed through the house, a rhythmic, terrifying thud. She hurtled off the porch, her boots skidding on the gravel as she dove into the van. Her hands shook so violently she dropped the keys. "Please, please, please," she whimpered. The engine roared to life, just as the black wolf cleared the porch in a single, impossible leap. She slammed the van into reverse, the tires spitting gravel. In the glow of her taillights, she saw them. The rest of the pack, 5 or 6 shadows emerging from the tree line like ghosts. She floored it. The van swayed dangerously on the narrow, mud-slicked road. In the rearview mirror, she could see the black wolf running alongside her, his speed defying nature. He wasn't trying to ram the car, he was hurting her. "Leave me alone," she screamed, tears of rage and terror blurring her vision. Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared from a side road, blinding her. Nova slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The van hydroplaned, spinning in a violent circle. The world became a kaleidoscope of shattering glass and twisting metal. The van rolled, tumbling into a deep, muddy ditch. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of a punctured radiator and the heavy thrum of the rain. Nova was upside down, the seatbelt cutting into her chest. Her arm felt like it had been hit by a sledgehammer, and a warm trickle of blood ran from her hairline into her eye. The scent of gasoline was thick, suffocating. A shadow fell over the wreckage. The door was torn away, not with a tool, but with a raw, terrifying strength that shredded the metal. Nova looked up, her vision swimming. Jaxon was there. He wasn't a wolf anymore. He stood in the rain, his clothes soaked, his face a mask of such raw, agonizing panic that for a second, she almost reached for him. He moved with a gentleness that didn't match his power, unhooking her belt and pulling her out of the steel cage. The moment his skin touched hers, the bond flared to life. It was a searing, electric connection that filled the empty spaces in her soul. It promised safety. It promised the end of the running. He held her against his chest, shielding her face from the downpour. He rested his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here." "You're safe now, Nova." Nova blinked, her strength fading. She felt the magnetic pull of his presence, trying to drown her defiance. She looked into his golden eyes, seeing the man and the beast intertwined. "You will never have me," she rasped, each word a jagged shard of glass. Jaxon's expression shattered, a look of profound grief crossing his face. But before she could see the tears, the darkness finally pulled her under. Chapter 5. Present day. King Damon had waited a year, and his patience had finally withered to nothing. He sat on his throne, his right leg propped over the armrest, the golden crown tilted carelessly atop his blonde locks. He examined his claws, the sharp points glinting in the torchlight. At his feet, a young courtier named Molly sat, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. Damon's hand rested on her shoulder, his grip just firm enough to serve as a reminder of his power. He enjoyed the way the room held its breath whenever he moved. Dominance was the only currency he valued. Damon was a leader who hungered for conquest, and his current obsession was a woman he had never met, Nova. the girl who had defied an alpha. The thought of her defiance made his blood hum with a dark, predatory interest. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the throne room slammed open. Rocco, Damon's second-in-command, marched in. He was dragging a woman behind him, disheveled, bruised, and clearly in distress. Damon straightened, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Is this her?" Damon asked, his voice a low, melodic purr. "No," Rocco replied, bowing his head. Anger flared in Damon's veins, cold and sharp. "No? I asked for the one Jaxon lost." "I do not take substitutes, Rocco." "My apologies, Your Highness," Rocco said quickly. Jaxon reached her first. His scouts intercepted our path near the Oklahoma border. There was a crash. "She is in his hands now." Damon's eyes narrowed. The girl at his feet, Molly, flinched at the sudden change in his aura. He dismissed her with a sharp wave of his hand, watching as she scrambled away into the shadows of the court. "Then who is this?" Damon gestured to the captive. Rocco grinned, a cruel light in his eyes. "This is Piper, the maid of Jaxon's second-in-command. A high-ranking prize, wouldn't you agree?" Damon stood, his steps slow and deliberate as he descended the dais. He approached Piper, who met his gaze with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He knelt in front of her, his crown sliding slightly. "Piper," he murmured. "A pretty name for a pretty bird in a cage. Tell me, where is Jaxon taking her? Where is he hiding his little runaway?" Piper remained silent, her jaw set in defiance. Damon sighed with feigned disappointment. He glanced back at the court, his eyes landing on Molly, who was watching from the sidelines. "Rocco, hold her," Damon ordered. Rocco gripped Piper's arms, forcing her to stand still. Damon turned his attention back to the room. "I find that silence is usually a lack of motivation. Let's provide some." He raised a hand, his claws extending. The room went deathly quiet. "Now, Piper," Damon said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You will tell me where Jaxon is keeping Nova, or I will ensure that no one in this court ever speaks your name again. I will make an example of those who harbor Jaxon's secrets." "I'll never tell you," Piper screamed, struggling against her restraints. Damon's expression hardened into a mask of cold stone. He didn't need to commit a graphic act to show his ruthlessness. He gestured to his guards. "Molly is no longer needed in this court. Remove her, permanently." As the guards dragged the sobbing girl away and the doors closed, Damon turned back to Piper. The psychological blow was struck. He didn't need to show the blood to show the cost of defiance. "Take her to the dungeons," Damon ordered, wiping a speck of dust from his sleeve. "And ensure she is kept uncomfortable. I will have my answers." Rocco nodded and dragged the shouting woman from the room. Damon sat back on his throne, his mind already spinning a new web. Nova would be his, and he would burn every pack in the country to find her. Chapter 6. Present day. Pain was a living thing, embracing Nova as she drifted between the fog of sleep and the harsh light of reality. She felt the swaying of her body, the scent of rain and musk filling her lungs. Her soul recognized the smell. It was the scent of the man from the club, but her mind screamed that it was a nightmare. She was incapable of running. Everything was on fire, her lungs, her heart, her very spirit. She felt Jaxon's hands smoothing her hair, a gentle vibration in his chest that tried to soothe her, but she didn't want comfort. She wanted the world to burn for what it had done to her. When she finally opened her eyes, she was on a medical table inside a moving plane. A doctor approached with a sedative, but Nova thrashed, her survival instincts overriding the agony in her limbs. "Shoo," Jaxon whispered, his eyes wide and fractured with worry as he held her down. "It's going to be okay." "It will never be okay," she thought as the world blurred into gray. "Not while you have me." As the sedative took hold, the memories she had buried for years rose like ghosts. She remembered the day the light died in her childhood home. She remembered her father's coldness, how he looked at her and saw only the ghost of the mother she resembled. She remembered the man who came to the door when she was 14. The man who brought news of her father's death in a way that shattered her childhood forever. She had spent years pretending to be an orphan, a girl with no last name, running from a past that was paved with shadows. Every time she heard Jaxon's voice, those shadows grew longer. To her, he wasn't a savior. He was just the latest man trying to cage her. Nova woke to the smell of disinfectant. Her head pounded, but the room was empty. Jaxon was gone. Leave. 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 Her father's voice rang in her mind like a bell. She forced herself up, the room spinning in dizzying circles. She ripped the monitors from her skin and the 4 from her arm, watching in a daze as the small puncture wound knit itself back together in seconds. The wolf's blood in her veins was a curse, but it was a useful one. She stumbled to the door, her breath coming in jagged gasps. A guard stepped into the room, reaching for his radio, but Nova didn't hesitate. She used the heavy metal 4-pole to knock him back, the desperation in her veins giving her a strength she shouldn't have had. She scrambled into the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. At the foot of the stairs, she could hear them, Jaxon and his men. Nova bolted upward, slamming through a set of white French doors. The sun blinded her, and the scent of fresh, pine-scented air filled her lungs. She was on a high balcony, the wind whipping her hospital gown around her pale legs. Nova, stop. She turned to see Jaxon standing in the doorway. His eyes were flashing between silver and gold, his face a mask of raw, bleeding regret. You ruined me, Nova said, her voice eerily calm as the wind dried her tears. You made me the very thing I spent my life running from. I'm sorry, Jaxon choked out, taking a cautious step forward. Just step back. Let me explain. You don't have to love me, Nova. Just let me help you. Nova looked out at the horizon, at the birds circling in the golden light of the sunset. For the first time in a year, she felt a strange, hollow peace. She didn't want to be a prize. She didn't want to be a monster. Sorry, she whispered, looking him in the eyes one last time. She didn't wait for him to reach her. She stepped back, letting the wind take her as she disappeared over the edge. Chapter 7. The silence following Nova's fall would haunt Jaxon for the rest of his life. He had stood on that balcony, paralyzed by the realization that he had pushed her too far. He had found her in that lonely house, rescued her from the wreckage of her van, and believed, with the arrogance of an alpha, that he could fix the damage he had caused. He was wrong. The bond had molded their souls together, but it hadn't been enough to bridge the gap of a year spent in fear. Jaxon looked down from the railing, his vision blurring. He felt the animal within him howl in agony, a sound that tore through his skin and echoed across the grounds. He hated himself. He had spent a year watching her from afar, thinking he was giving her time to heal, when in reality, he had been leaving her to fight a monster she didn't understand. He reached her where she lay on the grass, the wind whipping his hair into a frenzy. He cradled her against his chest, shielding her from the sudden, cold rain. She was so still, her face holding a hauntingly peaceful expression, as if she had finally escaped the storm he had brought into her life. You ruined me. Her final words circled his mind like a jagged blade. Alpha, Nash's voice was a soft, mourning whisper. The rest of the pack stood back, feeling the tidal wave of Jaxon's grief. We have to take her inside. We have to let the healers see her. I can't let her go, Jaxon choked out, his voice fracturing. He tucked his face into the crook of her neck. She still smelled of home, of pine and rain and the electricity that had sparked between them that first night in the club. He had been selfish from the start, and now he was losing the only thing that made his world turn. He stood with her in his arms, his tears mingling with the rain. He felt the weight of his failures. He had never properly apologized. He had never explained that she was a part of a world far older and more beautiful than the nightmare she'd lived. Inside the manor, the air felt heavy with the scent of disinfectant and sadness. He carried her to the medical wing, every step feeling like he was walking through lead. Dr. Ethan greeted him with a solemn bow, his eyes reflecting the Alpha's heartache. I will watch over her, Alpha, the old doctor promised. Jaxon placed Nova on the table, his hand lingering on hers. He sat beside her for hours, smoothing her hair and whispering apologies that he feared would never be heard. He looked at her small, bitten-down nails, the only sign of the silent suffering she'd endured while he stayed away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet room. "Nova, I am so sorry." He leaned down, brushing his lips against her forehead in what he believed was a final goodbye. He felt the crushing weight of a future without her, a life of shadows and regret. But then, the air in the room seemed to shift. A faint, rhythmic thrumming caught his attention. He froze, his wolf's hearing picking up a sound that shouldn't exist. He looked at her chest, holding his breath until his lungs burned. Then Nova's chest rose. It was a sharp, jagged inhale. Jaxon took a step back, his heart racing at a deafening pace. It wasn't possible, and yet, the scent of life was suddenly overwhelming. Nova bolted upright, her eyes snapping open as she gasped for air. She looked at her hands, then at the room, before her silver eyes met his. "Am I dead?" she asked, her voice a fragile rasp. Jaxon could only stare in shock. She was breathing. She was alive. The moon, it seemed, wasn't finished with them yet. Chapter 8. Present day. Jaxon sat by the medical bed, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He watched Nova breathe, the woman he had seen fall, only to defy the very laws of nature. Dr. Ethan was baffled. There was no medical explanation for how she had returned to them unscathed. But as Jaxon watched the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, he felt a flicker of something dark and ancient beneath her skin. She wasn't a wolf, he was sure of that now, but she was no longer merely human. Something had awakened in her that even his inner animal feared to approach. When she had first opened her eyes, she hadn't found peace. She had found fury. She had railed against the unfairness of her existence, her voice cracking with the weight of a year spent in the shadows. Jaxon had simply held her, letting her anger wash over him. He felt he deserved every ounce of her hatred. "Alpha." Nash stepped into the room, carrying a bouquet of bright yellow daffodils. He placed them in a glass on the windowsill, the sunlight catching the petals. "Mrs. Miriam sent these," Nash said softly. "They're a sign of new beginnings." She thought the Luna might need the reminder. Jaxon looked at the flowers, then back at Nova. "I don't know if she wants a new beginning, Nash. She's terrified of what she's becoming. And if word gets out about her, about how she survived that fall." "It won't," Nash promised, his voice firm. "But we have to know what we're dealing with. I've called Roxy. She's traveling through Europe, but she'll be back within the week. If anyone can sense the source of Nova's power, it's her." Jaxon nodded, though his mind was miles away. He thought of the men who had caused the crash, the ones who had taken Piper. They wanted Nova for the same reason he wanted to protect her. She was an anomaly. A prize. "We can't keep her sedated forever," Jaxon murmured, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "She's smart. She's already fought back once. But if I let her go, she'll run right into their hands." "Then we find a middle ground," Nash suggested. "But first, Alpha, you have to face the pack. They need to see their leader. And Colt, he needs his final honors." The air outside was cold, carrying the scent of pine and oncoming snow. The pack stood in a silent circle, their heads bowed in mourning. Jaxon stood at the front, dressed in a black suit that felt like a cage. Before him lay Colt, his beta and his oldest friend. Colt had given his life to protect the secret of the Luna, and the grief in the air was a physical weight. Jaxon picked up the ceremonial torch, his hand trembling slightly. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of a much darker one. "To the goddess," Jaxon whispered, his voice carrying over the silent woods. He lowered the flame to the pyre. Smoke rose into the autumn sky, carrying with it the memories of a brother lost. Each pack member stepped forward, offering a token of remembrance, a photo, a carved stone, a prayer. As the flames grew, Jaxon felt the shift beginning. It wasn't the agonizing tear of his early years, but a fluid, purposeful surge of power. His shadow lengthened and warped on the grass. The man in the suit vanished, replaced by a massive, midnight black wolf. He wasn't just a grieving mate anymore. He was a king at war. Jaxon threw his head back and let out a long, mournful howl that vibrated through the marrow of everyone present. It was a vow of vengeance for Colt, a promise of rescue for Piper, and a desperate plea to the moon for the woman sleeping in the medical wing. He would be the monster Nova feared if it meant keeping her alive. Chapter 9. Present day. Nova's eyes snapped open. Dust particles danced in the harsh morning sun rays filtering through the tall, arched windows. Every sense she possessed was dialed to a screaming frequency. She could hear the rhythmic rush of blood in her own veins, a sound like a distant, pulsing drum. Memories of the previous night crashed over her in a cold wave. The balcony. The wind. The sudden, terrifying plunge into the dark. She had died, she was certain of it. She had felt the world slip away, only to be violently yanked back into her skin by a force she didn't understand. She moved to sit up, but the sharp, rhythmic clink of metal shattered the silence. High-security restraints were locked around her wrists, anchored to the heavy oak headboard. Her blood boiled. After a year of running for her life, she was being treated like a feral animal. "Welcome back to the living," Jaxon's voice came from the shadows of the corner. He was leaning against a dresser, his dark hair damp from a recent shower, but his eyes were sunken and shadowed with a fatigue that bordered on soul-crushing. His scent, rain and crushed pine filled the room, and to Nova's fury, her inner self seemed to lean toward it, seeking the comfort of the bond she had fought so hard to break. "Undo these, Jaxon," Nova said, her voice a jagged shard of ice. "Now." "I can't," Jaxon replied, his voice a low rumble. "Not until we know what happened out there. You fell from a height that would have ended a wolf, Nova. And yet, an hour later, your heart was beating as if you'd only been asleep. No broken bones. No internal bleeding. Just you. What am I then?" Nova hissed, her eyes shimmering with a silver light that wasn't human. "Am I your prisoner?" "You're a miracle," Jaxon murmured, stepping into the light. His golden eyes searched hers with a mix of awe and terror. "And a target. You aren't a wolf and you aren't human. I didn't sense your humanity at the club, but I didn't sense the beast either. You are something ancient, Nova. Something even my people have forgotten. I am what you made me," she screamed, lunging forward. The restraints snapped tight, yanking her back against the headboard with a jarring thud. "You're the reason my life is a wreckage of glass and blood." Jaxon winced, the pain in his expression looking far more real than the physical blow. "I wanted to apologize for that night. I acted on instinct because the moment I saw you I knew. I felt the bond, the thread that ties the other half of our souls together for eternity. I thought you felt it too." Nova closed her eyes, fighting the traitorous warmth his words ignited. "I felt a trap, Jaxon. And look where I am. Chained to a bed in a house I never wanted to see." "You're safe here," he insisted, his voice growing desperate. "The men who caused the crash, the Lycans. They are still out there. They've been tracking you for months. They are an ancient, bloodthirsty species, and if they realize you have the power to defy death, they will never stop hunting you. Here, you have a pack. You have a chance." For the next 6 days, the manor became a gilded cage. Jaxon kept a revolving watch on her, his sister Roxy returning from her travels to study the strange, smoky energy Nova seemed to project when she was angry. Nash, Jaxon's Delta, brought her meals and even a set of oil paints, trying to bridge the gap with stories of the great goddess, Diana, and the balance of nature. Nova played the part of the captive, her mind working through escape routes even as her body betrayed her. She noticed the way Jaxon's shoulders tensed when he was near her, the way his pupils dilated whenever their eyes met. She was his mate, and he was starving for her presence, a fact she intended to use as a weapon. On the 7th day, Jaxon stood at the foot of her bed, a heavy iron key glinting in the light. "If I see you as a danger to yourself or this pack," he warned, his voice thick with a warning he clearly didn't want to give, "I will secure this room again." "Do we have an agreement, Nova? No more running." "Not until we find the Lycans." "I'll stay," Nova said, her voice low and dangerous. "But don't mistake my presence for submission, Jaxon. I'm only staying until I find a way to finish what I started. Jaxon unlocked the restraints. As the metal fell away, Nova stood, her muscles coiling with a new, dark strength. She rubbed her reddened wrists, her silver eyes locking onto his golden ones. The air between them crackled with a tension that felt like a coming storm. She was free of the chains, but as she looked at the alpha, she realized the mate bond was a tether no key could ever truly undo. Chapter 10. Darkness flooded her vision, cold and absolute. Nova gasped, her lungs feeling heavy as if the very air had turned to ink. Her eyes were frantically wide, searching the void for any spark of light that might save her. A chilling sensation slithered across her skin, a phantom weight that left a trail of ice against her legs. A shudder passed through Nova's body. Disgust rolled through her in waves as the unseen presence traced its way upward, a cold mark of a debt she didn't understand. In the corner of the room, a figure materialized. Obsidian eyes stared at her with a hollow intensity. A man in a sharp black suit stood with his arms crossed, a mocking smirk lingering on his lips. Recognition flashed through her, a flicker of a memory from a lifetime ago, but the flame of knowledge was doused by the shadows before it could grow. "You will pay for the past," the figure hissed. His presence felt like a physical weight, dark veins appearing beneath the skin of his face as the darkness pooled around his feet like a living thing. The moment the shadow vapors touched her skin, a silent cry caught in her throat. Nova felt the sting of tears. She wanted to scream that she was innocent of whatever ancient grudge he held, but the darkness continued its assault, an icy pressure that left her mind reeling. When the man moved closer, his expression shifting into something predatory, Nova's eyes closed on instinct. Fear gripped her. Her heart pounded like a wild drum against her ribs. This was a psychological siege, a dark force compelling her to let go of her very will. "You will pay for the echoes of your father's choices," the man whispered. He stepped closer, and her body shook with tremors. Nova hadn't thought of her father in years, but now his shadow loomed over her. She felt a sharp, cold sting across her cheek, a phantom pain that felt far too real. The shadows wrapped around her like a restrictive cocoon. An icy constriction flooded her chest, stealing her breath as if the air had turned to smoke. She tasted the bitter tang of ash on her tongue, the sensation boiling within her until the world finally splintered. "Nova." Someone smoothed her sweat-covered hair out of her face, their breath a warm contrast to the nightmare's chill. She was pressed against a muscular chest, the scent of earthy musk and rain filled her lungs, acting as an anchor for her drifting senses. Her body ached. When she tried to speak, her throat felt raw, as if the dream had left a physical toll. "Nova." The voice was a quiet, urgent murmur. A hand traced the side of her face, checking for injuries. Nova briefly opened her eyes, seeing Jaxon's silhouette in the dim light. The nightmare still echoed in the back of her mind, a dark hum that wouldn't go away. "It was just a dream," Jaxon whispered, rocking her gently. His voice was steady, but she could sense the underlying tension in his frame. Exhaustion coated her limbs like a heavy lead weight. The warmth of his body urged her to relax, to let the terrors of the past fly away. "He's coming for me," Nova muttered, caught in the haze between sleep and waking. Jaxon smoothed back another strand of hair, his presence a protective barrier against the void. She was so tired of the running and the shadows. She let herself be lulled into the safety of his scent, and for a few hours, the dreams were silent. When morning came, her body was sore, the memory of the nightmare sitting like a stone in her stomach. It was getting worse as the full moon approached, the darkness within her skin feeling more tangible with each passing day. She avoided her reflection as she dressed, her fingers tracing the stinging, raised welt on her cheek. It was a physical echo of the night's terrors, a mark that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. The girl she was now was not the same girl she had been. The glimpses of peace she felt were now shadowed by a growing guilt for the things she had done to survive. A sour taste lingered at the tip of her tongue, and she worried it would soon overpower her. Jaxon had been right to worry. She felt like a marionette, and the darkness was beginning to pull the strings. At 11 a.m., a knock sounded at the door. Nova had spent the morning staring at a blank page in the sketchbook Nash had brought her. Normally, drawing was her escape, her journal of truth. But how could she depict the chaos within her? The wolf who held her captive? The ancient king who haunted her dreams? She had never dared to draw Jaxon, though she knew every curve and shadow of his face. She could depict him perfectly, a sculpture of strength mixed with the bitterness of her own heart, but the thought of focusing on him felt like surrendering. She sharpened her pencil for the 15th time, her hair falling in front of her eyes. She sighed, frustrated by the lack of inspiration, when the door swung open. The pencil lead snapped. Jaxon strolled in, a cautious look lingering behind his silver eyes. He sat on the floor opposite her, the large window casting his frame in silhouette. He was a predator at heart, and the way he studied her made shivers trail down her spine. "Can I help you?" Nova's tone was curt. "I have a proposition," Jaxon said, his face remaining expressionless as he glanced at her blank sketchbook. Nova attempted to hide her intrigue. "A proposition?" "Another deal for information." "An exchange," Jaxon corrected. "You haven't left this room in days. I thought you might like a change of scenery." "Breakfast in the kitchen." Nova hesitated. "Why?" "Because," Jaxon stood, brushing off his jeans. "I'd rather you be involved in the search than kept in the dark. And because you can't stay hidden forever." He led her through the manor, his footsteps light. The house was strangely quiet, a grand structure that felt empty of the family life Nova had always envied. When they reached the kitchen, a sprawling space of marble and green plants, Jaxon began to prepare food with practiced, precise movements. "You didn't answer my question," Nova said, sitting on a bar stool. "Damon," Jaxon said, mixing batter for pancakes. "He's the king of the lichens. He's been ruling for 4 centuries, Nova. He is powerful, cunning, and abnormally young for his age. Roxy thinks he's the one orchestrating the hunt for you." Nova nodded, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin as a phantom memory of a sharp nail brushed her mind. "Why is he so persistent?" "I've never met him." "We don't know," Jaxon responded. Suddenly, a headache bloomed within Nova's temples. It was followed by a sharp, cold pressure, the shadow self within her hissing at Jaxon's proximity. The darkness turned icy, and a sudden, violent impulse slammed against her consciousness. "Nova." Jaxon's hands were on her shoulders. His touch felt like a brand. Nova felt her instincts flare, her nails sharpening as the pressure within her mind intensified. She needed to get away. Her legs felt weak as a scent of decay filled her senses. "I'm okay," she lied, but her control was slipping. When Jaxon reached out to steady her, she recoiled, her hand catching his forearm as the darkness surged. She saw the gleam of the kitchen knives on the counter, a dark, intrusive impulse screaming for her to strike, even as her heart begged for it to stop. "Get away," she sobbed, pushing herself back from him. She didn't want to hurt him, but the darkness was laughing, pulling the strings with an urgency she couldn't fight. Her sanity felt like it was dissolving into black smoke. As Jaxon called for help, Nova realized with a surge of horror what she was truly becoming. Chapter 11. Nova. Jaxon's voice was a low murmur as she cowered in the corner of the kitchen. A bitter, metallic taste filled her mouth, sharp and acidic. He took a step closer, his hand extended, his golden eyes wide and frantic. As she inhaled, she recognized a scent that made her pulse thunder. It was the sharp tang of fear. To her horror, the rising darkness within her seemed to thrive on it, drawing a cold energy from his hesitation. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice soft, but the shadow self beneath her skin recoiled from his presence. His fingers glided down her cheek, smoothing over the faint, phantom mark on her skin. She held his gaze, her breath coming in labored hitches, terrified that any sudden movement would shatter her remaining control. "What am I?" Her voice cracked. Jaxon moved closer, his scent of rain and musk engulfing her. He didn't have an answer. His own confusion mirrored her own. As he pulled his hand away, the darkness surged with a sudden, violent urgency. Her gaze flickered toward the gleam of the cutlery on the counter. The air between them felt charged, like a coming storm. In a sudden, desperate explosion of movement, Nova pushed him back with a strength that defied her frame. The impulse to strike was a screaming static in her mind, a slave to a voice she didn't recognize. Tears blurred her eyes as she staggered toward the door, her palms slick with cold sweat. The pressure in her head was a physical weight, forcing her to get away, away from the kitchen, away from the man whose presence made the darkness grow. She reached the foyer, the double doors to the outside gleaming under the flickering lights. She couldn't stay. As her hand wrapped around the handle, she realized the presence wasn't powerful enough to stop her yet. It wanted her to reach a breaking point so it could finally take the wheel. A memory flashed, black, vein-covered eyes. She had seen that man before, years ago, but the details remained locked behind a wall of shadow. Wind and rain battered her face as she staggered outside. The ground was a carpet of orange and brown leaves, smelling of autumn and transition. She wanted to be like the birds circling above, free and weightless. An arm suddenly snaked around her waist. On instinct, Nova turned with impossible speed. Her eyes shimmered with a mercurial light, her breathing heavy as the dark veins pulsed beneath her skin. Nash's face turned ashen at the sight of her. He raised his hands in a calming gesture, cornering her like a frightened animal. "Nova, wait," he urged, his heartbeat loud in her ears. She caught her reflection in a rain-slicked puddle and recoiled. Her skin looked unnaturally pale, traced by faint, shadowy lines that seemed to thrum with a life of their own. A visual echo of the darkness trying to claim her. She let go of Nash's arm, her insides twisting with a self-hatred that burned like acid. Before Nash could speak, a terrifying roar splintered the air. Jaxon lunged into view, his eyes burning with a predatory ferocity that had Nova's heart skipping a beat. He looked dark, dangerous, and completely focused on the distance between her and Nash. "Step away," Jaxon commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. The rain turned into a sudden storm, lightning fracturing the sky. As Nash stepped back to protect her, Jaxon's power boiled over. The air distorted with the force of his transformation. A massive shadow lunged, and within seconds, the two wolves were a blur of fur and snarls. Jaxon's sheer alpha power overwhelmed Nash, tossing the smaller wolf aside. Nash slumped to the grass, breath gasping, as Jaxon turned his predatory gaze back to Nova. Nova backed away, her voice a fragile whisper. "No. Please." Jaxon began to shed his animal form, his head hanging low as he regained control. His golden eyes were feral as they watched her. He moved toward her, his presence looming, and Nova felt the fight drain out of her. The darkness within her hissed and retreated. It recognized something in Jaxon it couldn't overcome. Jaxon reached for her, his hand tangling in her hair as he sought to ground her, his nose brushing the side of her face. The proximity fueled her panic, her fists pushing against his chest as the alpha's authority weighed down on her like lead. Suddenly, he was ripped away. Nova's eyes widened at the sight of a woman with brown curly hair and green eyes standing protectively in front of her. "Restrain him," the woman yelled to the guards who had suddenly appeared. She hauled Nova up. "Can you walk?" Nova nodded, her head spinning from the adrenaline. Quickly, the woman pulled her toward a white SUV. Nova didn't hesitate. The sound of Jaxon's frustrated growls made leaving the only option. Inside the car, the heater hummed, slowly chasing away the chill of the rain. The woman drove through the mechanical gates of the estate, heading deep into the forest. "Who are you?" Nova asked, her lips still pale. "Roxy, Jaxon's sister," the woman said with a small, reassuring smile. "Sorry about the caveman routine back there. He doesn't know how to handle what's happening any better than you do." "A caveman is a good description," Nova whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. They passed through a picturesque, hidden town within the pack borders, a place of unique shops and vibrant graffiti. Roxy stopped the car near a quiet brick building. "I own this place," Roxy said, opening a dark wooden door. "I thought you might want to stay here. Away from the manor. Away from him." Nova walked into the living room, taking in the light wood floors and the abundance of green plants. It felt like the home she had always imagined in her sketches. "Why are you helping me?" "Because," Roxy said, her smile sincere, "I know how it feels to want to escape a destiny you didn't ask for. Take a warm shower. I'll get us some food, and then we're going to figure out exactly what's in your blood." Roxy left, and the door shut quietly. Nova stripped off her wet clothes and stepped under the hot water. As the steam rose, the flashes of her nightmare returned. The man in the black suit, the shadow veins, and the terrifying truth that her past was finally catching up to her. Chapter 12. Nova stared at the empty space where the man had stood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that the darkness within her seemed to mimic. She didn't call for the guards. Instead, she backed away from the window, her gaze fixed on the spot until her legs hit the edge of the sofa and she collapsed onto the cushions. The blonde man. The red eyes. It was a warning, a physical manifestation of the threats she had spent a lifetime outrunning. They weren't just in her head anymore. They were at the gates of the one place she was supposed to be safe. She stayed awake until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the town in hues of gold and pink. When the light finally filled the room, the vibrant colors of her painting seemed to mock her. The black wolf, the representation of Jaxon, looked less like a predator and more like a sentinel. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Nova didn't move, her eyes fixed on the door handle. It turned slowly, and Roxy stepped inside, carrying a tray with breakfast and a fresh pot of tea. She stopped when she saw Nova still sitting on the sofa, her clothes unchanged and her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Nova," Roxy whispered, setting the tray on the coffee table. Her gaze drifted to the canvas standing in the center of the room. She went silent, her eyes tracing the lines of the black wolf and the explosion of color behind it. "You did this." Nova nodded once, her throat too dry for words. Roxy stepped closer to the painting, her expression one of awe. "It's beautiful. It's him. Exactly as he is." She turned back to Nova, her green eyes searching. "Did you sleep at all?" "There was a man," Nova finally said, her voice a raspy shadow of its usual self. "Last night. Outside, under the lamp." Roxy's posture stiffened instantly. "What man?" "Blonde. Red eyes. He was watching me." Nova hugged her knees to her chest. "He looked like he was waiting for something." Roxy didn't hesitate. She pulled a small device from her pocket and spoke a few quick commands into it. Within seconds, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "Stay here," Roxy commanded, her voice no longer the gentle tone of a friend, but that of a leader. She stepped out into the hall, and Nova heard the low murmur of voices, urgent and sharp. Nova closed her eyes. The peace she had felt after finishing the painting was gone, replaced by the cold realization that the world she had tried to build for herself was crumbling. She wasn't just a girl with a dark secret. She was a target. When Roxy returned, she looked grimmer than before. The guards didn't see anyone, but we're pulling the security footage. Jaxon is on his way. Nova flinched at the name. No, I don't want him here. Nova, if there's someone out there with red eyes, lichens or something worse, you can't be alone. Not in your condition. Roxy sat on the edge of the sofa, reaching out but stopping before she touched Nova's hand. He's the alpha. It's his job to protect the pack, and whether you like it or not, you're under his protection now. I never asked for it, Nova muttered, though the fight was leaving her. I know, Roxy said softly. But look at that painting, Nova. You didn't paint a monster. You painted a protector. Your soul knows the difference, even if your head hasn't caught up yet. Nova looked back at the canvas. The black wolf stood firm against the forest of blood, a barrier between the viewer and the death behind it. She realized Roxy was right. In the middle of her terror, the thought of Jaxon arriving didn't just bring fear, it brought a tiny, flickering spark of relief. The sound of a car skidding to a halt on the street below signaled his arrival. Moments later, the front door to the building slammed open. The stairs creaked under the weight of someone moving at an impossible speed. Jaxon burst into the room. He was disheveled, his shirt rumpled and his hair a mess, but his eyes were burning with a golden intensity that filled the small apartment. He didn't look at the painting. His gaze locked onto Nova. He was across the room in a heartbeat, dropping to his knees in front of her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his body was like a furnace against her chilled skin. Are you hurt? His voice was a low growl, thick with suppressed emotion. Nova shook her head, unable to look away from the storm in his eyes. He was just watching. Jaxon's jaw tightened. He finally looked up at Roxy. Get the perimeter tightened. I want double guards on this block. No one goes in or out without my personal clearance. On it, Roxy said, casting one last look at Nova before heading for the door. Silence settled over the room, heavy and charged. Jaxon turned his attention back to Nova. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he finally let his fingers graze her cheek, the same spot where the nightmare had left its phantom mark. I'm not letting them near you again, he promised. It wasn't a boast, it was a vow. Nova looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the monster from the club or the alpha who had lunged at Nash. She saw the man who had stayed by her side through the screams and the chaos. Why? She whispered. Jaxon let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. Because we are bound, Nova. And I will stand between you and the dark until my last breath. Nova didn't pull away. For the first time since her world had fractured, the weight of her survival felt like a gift rather than a burden. She wasn't just enduring the cycle anymore, she was choosing to face it. Chapter 13. 3 days had passed since Jaxon had last seen Nova and his sister. With every passing hour, he felt a deepening ache in his chest, a phantom tether pulling him toward the town. Logically, he knew Nova was safe under Roxy's watchful care, tucked away in that brick apartment. Yet his mind stayed trapped in a loop, replaying the memory of her fall, the terror in her eyes, and the impossible way she had returned to him. It wasn't just Nova's safety that consumed him. It was the mystery of her nature. If King Damon was hunting her, there was a reason that defied the laws of their kind. Jaxon set his glass down, the heavy thud echoing in the empty, shadowed wing of the manor. Since the night he had nearly lost control and lashed out at Nash, this room had become his sanctuary and his cage. He rubbed his face, the weight of his responsibilities as Alpha feeling like a physical burden. Guilt was a constant companion. He had overstepped the boundaries of the bond, reaching for her when she was at her most vulnerable. He ran a hand through his dark hair, frustrated by the primal instincts that had clouded his judgment. He walked toward the window, staring out at the rolling hills. The sky was an endless, bruised purple, and the wind had begun to howl as autumn surrendered to the first bite of winter. His nostrils flared as he caught a blur of movement in the distance. As the wolf approached the manor, the shadows seemed to ripple and lengthen. Under the pale light of the moon, the beast shifted, the silhouette of a wolf smoothing into the form of a woman. Jaxon breathed a sigh of relief. Roxy was back. It took her nearly 10 minutes to reach his study. Jaxon leaned against the wall, his shirt rumpled, his presence weary. Roxy let out a sharp whistle as she took in the state of the room, the overturned chairs and the heavy silence. A glint of older sister amusement touched her face, though her eyes remained serious. "The damage is only visible in your wing," Roxy noted, scanning the wreckage. "Tell me, brother, what have you been up to while I was gone?" "Worrying," Jaxon replied bitterly. "You didn't answer your phone." "I was researching," Roxy said, stepping past him to look at the cold fireplace. "If you want to earn Nova's trust, you have to find a better way to handle the pressure than brooding in the dark." Jackson's jaw tightened. "You took her from me." She was terrified, Jaxon. "You were trying to anchor a connection before she even knew who she was," Roxy reminded him gently. "She wouldn't have forgiven you for that. Neither would your own soul." He knew she was right. He was grateful she had intervened, even if the memory of hurting Nash, his most loyal friend, felt like a brand on his skin. "How is she?" Jaxon asked, unable to meet her gaze. "She's unlike anything I've ever seen," Roxy said, her voice dropping to a serious whisper. "There is a darkness in her blood, Jaxon. A shadow that shouldn't be there. If we don't figure out how to stabilize it soon, I'm afraid of what it might do to her." The thought of Nova losing herself to that void made Jackson's stomach turn. "Go," Roxy commanded, pointing toward the door. "You haven't shifted in days. The man is drowning and the wolf is starving. Run until your head clears." "I'll handle the cleanup here." Jaxon didn't argue. He knew the internal pressure was reaching a breaking point. He remembered his first shift at 13, the sheer, overwhelming force of that night, the way his human frame had changed to make room for the beast within. As he burst through the manor doors, the change took him mid-stride. It was a fluid surge of power, a release of the tension that had been building for 72 hours. Paws thundered against the frozen earth, soil flying behind him with every stride. In his wolf form, the war and the guilt felt distant, replaced by the pure, sharp instinct of the predator. He ran until his lungs burned, the scent of pine and oncoming snow filling his senses. He spotted a rabbit in the underbrush, his golden eyes locking on with lethal precision. He lunged a swift end, the wolf's hunger satisfied even as the man's conscience flickered with a strange remorse. But the peace was short-lived. A long, mournful howl fractured the silence of the woods. It was Nash, calling out with an urgency that sent a chill through Jackson's fur. Other howls rose in response, the pack acknowledging a high-level emergency. Jaxon took off, a blur of midnight fur against the trees. Someone had breached the perimeter. He reached the gates of the manor and skidded to a halt, the human part of him reacting in horror. Piper lay on the cold pavement. Her vibrant red hair was fanned out against the stone, her skin deathly pale in the moonlight. She was breathing, but only just. The pack stood in a protective circle around her, their hackles raised. Anger, cold and absolute, boiled in Jackson's blood when he saw the nature of the message. Beside Piper, a crumpled piece of parchment lay weighted by a blood-stained stone, a silent, chilling warning from the king who had sent her back. Jaxon looked into Nash's shattered eyes and knew the time for hiding was over. King Damon was at their doorstep, and the war for Nova's soul had officially begun. Chapter 14. By the time Nova had fallen asleep, it was past 4 a.m. Her mind had been in overdrive since she had seen the man. The red eyes, the blonde hair, she was certain she had seen him before, or something like him. But where? When she had gone to the hallway in search of guards, the building was empty. No one had called or explained anything, leaving her alone with the memory of that howl. She was certain it was a warning, but the source remained a mystery. Not long after she fell asleep, a loud banging echoed through the apartment. Her eyes, blurred from exhaustion, barely had time to open before Roxy stormed in. The tension between them was palpable, but the paleness of Roxy's face and her thin, set lips halted any comments. Nova bolted upright as Roxy began packing clothes with a frantic, rhythmic speed. "What's going on?" Nova's voice was croaky, the heavy weight of fatigue settling in her chest. There was an intruder last night. They left a message, Roxy said, her throat bobbing as she folded a shirt. The light illuminated Roxy's grim expression and the slight tremor in her hands. Something terrible had happened. Get up. A pair of leggings and a shirt were thrown into Nova's lap. Are we traveling? Nova asked, her muscles aching as she swung her legs over the bed. Roxy gave a curt nod. We have to. Now. Nova didn't protest. At this point, solving this mystery alone was a losing battle. Damon. The name sat heavily in her mind. It took Nova only a minute to dress. When she emerged, Roxy was seated on the sofa, gazing out the French windows. Nova inhaled the familiar scent of sadness and anger. Nova sat down next to her, struggling to find the right words. What's going? Colt's dead. Roxy didn't meet her eyes. Who? Colt. He was Jaxon's beta. Our friend for over a century, Roxy said, finally turning. He died in that crash to protect you. To give Jaxon a chance to keep this pack together. The breath was knocked out of Nova. Guilt clouded her mind. Someone had sacrificed their life for hers. That night, Piper, Colt's mate, was taken, Roxy continued, her eyes burning with disgust. They delivered her to our doorstep last night as a warning. They got past our borders. You can't stay here. What are you saying? We have safe houses. We're traveling south, near the Mexico border, to an allied pack. The rest of the pack will stay here to defend the manor, Roxy explained. Nova realized the crushing weight of reality. People were at risk because of the king's obsession. How many more would have to sacrifice themselves? She didn't want to rely on the wolves, yet she had no choice. She had sworn not to let the darkness in, but if she had to become a shield to stop this, she would. Come, Roxy said. Jaxon's waiting. Nova took her sketchbook, put on her shoes, and followed. She didn't look back at the apartment. It had never been hers. Jaxon's hands gripped the steering wheel as she entered the car. His eyes, a burning gold, stared straight ahead. The scent of rain and musk made Nova's head spin. She gripped her sketchbook tightly as she sat in the leather seat, her heart pounding. Roxy shut the door and glanced between them. Less of the tension, please. We have a long drive. Heat traveled up Nova's neck. Instead of responding, she flipped to a blank page and began to draw. For the next several hours, she focused only on the paper. No Jaxon, no darkness, and no fear. Just the lines of her pen against the white page, carving out a space where the world couldn't reach her. Chapter 15. They had been on the road for over 20 hours. Throughout the journey, they had taken several stops, mostly for Nova, who still functioned like a human, requiring regular meals and the brief, restless snatches of sleep that her mind allowed. During a stop at a gas station, Jaxon had suggested that if she let him complete the bond, she would no longer be partially human. He argued that the transition would stabilize the recent surge of darkness in her veins. Since that argument, they had ridden in a heavy, charged silence. His words had left an imprint on her mind, fueling an anxiety that made her stomach churn. Had she ever been truly human? During her years running from foster homes, Nova had clung to her humanity as the one thing that separated her from the monsters she feared. But with the recent flare-ups, her mercury-dark eyes, the sharpening of her senses, she was starting to doubt her own nature. The car remained quiet as they sped across the Texas plains, the only sound the rhythmic scratch of Nova's pencil against her sketchbook. Jaxon continued to ignore her, and while she felt she deserved his frustration, the distance still stung. They needed boundaries if they were going to survive the Leakin King, but they also needed a bridge. As they approached the outskirts of Houston, Jaxon's resolve finally seemed to break. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice low. He sported a shadow of a beard, and his eyes lacked their usual golden spark. Nova's stomach rumbled in betrayal. She nodded, turning back to the window as they pulled into a roadside diner. The smell of grease and fried eggs hit Nova as they entered. They took a booth at the back with a clear view of the entrance. "You could learn to control your senses," Roxy whispered, noticing Nova's discomfort. "It's harder since you're still in between, but the focus helps." I've never heard of anyone staying in between for this long, Roxy admitted quietly as they scanned the menus. Nova knew what she meant. She was a biological impossibility, a girl who had survived death too many times to be counted as normal. When the door jingled, the scent of musk and rain signaled Jaxon's return from checking the perimeter. He slid into the booth next to Nova, his heat radiating like a furnace. "What did you get?" he asked. "Pancakes," Nova replied, her voice more breathless than she intended. "Cat got your tongue?" Jaxon teased, a ghost of a smirk appearing. "More like the wolf got my sanity," Nova muttered, turning back to the window. Her heart skipped a beat as several men stepped into the diner. They wore leather jackets and moved with a cold, predatory superiority. Nova's blood turned to ice. She recognized the man with the ginger hair from Manhattan. These were Damon's lichens. Nova bumped her knee against Jaxon's as the men took a booth near the front, effectively blocking their only exit. Jaxon's frame went rigid as he sensed her sudden shift in heart rate. Nova leaned in, her lips close to his ear. "At the front," she whispered. "4 of them. They've been trailing me for months." Jaxon's body froze. To any observer, they looked like a couple sharing a private moment, but under the table, Nova's hands were shaking. She reached into Jaxon's pocket, sliding his phone out with a steady hand. She quickly typed a message to his lead guard, Dale, and slid the device back. Minutes passed, the tension thick enough to taste. Nova felt a familiar thrum pulsing through her, the cold presence of the darkness. It raked at her consciousness, triggered by the proximity of the threat. She realized she was a ticking time bomb. "I need to get out," she muttered, sliding out of the booth. Jaxon grabbed her wrist, a silent, desperate warning in his eyes, but she pulled away. She caught the eye of the lead Leakin and offered a taunting, defiant grin before heading for the door. She wanted them out of the diner, away from the innocent people inside. She stepped into the warm Texas air and walked toward the side of the building. The heavy thud of overturned tables and the fierce snarls of a struggle erupted from inside the diner. Jaxon was engaging the others with a force that rattled the windows. Nova stopped under a flickering lamp near a water tank. The presence of the lichens behind her was suffocating, but she refused to show fear. She let her anger sharpen into a weapon. "Thought you'd never leave your alpha side," a voice sneered from the shadows. Nova turned, her eyes shimmering with that mercury light. "It's against the law to stalk people," she said, her nails lengthening. "I thought you'd have taken the hint by now." The Leakin snarled, his eyes flashing a vivid, predatory red. "Careful, princess. You're a long way from home." The roar of an engine approached. Nova hoped it was Dale's unit. "We won't harm your alpha if you come with us," the man said, stepping into the light. Nova let out a sharp, cold laugh. "Who says I care?" Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the air. The Leakin's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before he slumped forward, his weight momentarily pinning Nova before she scrambled back, realizing the threat had been neutralized by a distant, precise strike. Nova stood over him, the darkness in her veins pulsing with a terrifying, hollow satisfaction. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time, she wasn't the only one doing the running. Chapter 16. The sight before her was one of total destruction. 2 SUVs blocked the exit, glass glittered across the asphalt like diamonds, and the weight of the loss was staggering. Only a handful of Jaxon's men remained standing against the unnatural durability of the Leakin scouts. Nova inhaled, her senses sharp despite the chaos. She could hear Jaxon's low, vibrating growl and the frantic rhythm of Roxy's pulse nearby. They were alive. A guard fired repeatedly at a Leakin with hazel eyes, but the attacker seemed to absorb the impact with terrifying ease, his eyes glowing a vivid, predatory red. Jaxon's wolf lunged, clashing with the Leakin in a blur of fur and ferocious power. Nova knew Jaxon couldn't sustain this fight alone. She was limited without a transformation, but she was a survivor. She knew every trick for making the environment a weapon. She looked at the high-pressure tank attached to the brick wall. A plan sparked in her mind, a trick learned years ago during her life on the run. Before she could move, a heavy force slammed her against the wall. A groan of pain escaped her as a Lycan pinned her in place, his presence cold and suffocating. Not so fast, his voice was a low, animalistic harshness. Nova didn't flinch. She offered a defiant, sharp grin. Sorry about this. Before the Lycan could react, Roxy swung a heavy iron post into his side with a resounding thud. The impact sent him staggering. Nova watched with a mix of awe and terror as the Lycan's frame distorted and surged, his shadow stretching across the pavement until a massive, ancient beast stood where the man had been. The beast tipped its head back and let out a howl that shook the very foundations of the building. The ground vibrated like a minor earthquake. Then, from the darkness of the trees, a response came, a chorus of predatory hunger. Within seconds, the beast lunged toward Roxy, his massive power pinning her. Nova threw herself forward, her nails catching his shoulder, but he brushed her aside with a force that sent her tumbling. She hit the wall hard, stars dancing in her vision. Drop her. A wave of absolute authority swept across the parking lot. The command was so heavy it felt like the air itself had solidified. Every wolf and Lycan froze, bowing their heads on an instinct they couldn't control. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Nova's breath hitched as his face came into the dim light. His features were perfectly sculpted, his cheekbones defined, and his sea-green eyes were filled with a chilling, dark fascination. Damon. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine followed him, a strange, elegant contrast to the scent of the struggle. He stood 10 meters away, his presence commanding the circle of beasts around him. Nova felt the darkness within her skin recoil, hissing at the sight of him. Hello, Nova. I've been looking for you. Damon's grin widened, his gaze measuring her worth. You're in a bit of a mess, aren't you? He turned his attention toward Jaxon, who was being held down by a hazel-eyed Lycan. The terror in Jackson's eyes wasn't for himself, it was for her. Kale, Damon addressed the Lycan. Please show Alpha Jaxon what happens when someone stands in my way. No. Nova's voice was a jagged rasp. She knew Damon was baiting her. She knew he wanted to see her break. I'll do anything, she said, her voice dropping to a flat, emotionless tone. Damon knelt in front of her, his presence heavy and menacing. Anything, Nova? Your freedom for a wolf you barely know? Perhaps you'd come with me willingly. He reached into her space, his gaze boring into hers with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. I'll go with you, she vowed. Just let them live. A smirk grew on Damon's face. A fair trade. Let's get you ready for the journey then. He reached out as if to assist her, but Nova felt a white-hot flash of sensation as her body, fueled by the darkness in her veins, began to knit her injuries back together with impossible speed. Laughter bubbled in her chest, a wild, dark sound. The pain didn't break her, it ignited her. With a sudden, explosive movement, Nova struck out. Damon was caught off guard, the impact sending him stumbling back against the brickwork. Nova didn't waste a second. She reached for the pipe on the high-pressure tank and wrenched it free. A wall of high-pressure water erupted, the sheer force of it sending the nearest Lycans flying. Go! Now, she screamed. The chaos provided the opening they needed. Jaxon lunged toward Roxy, scooping her up as they scrambled for the SUV. Dale, the last guard standing, provided cover fire as they dove into the vehicle. Nova pulled herself into the driver's seat, her hands steady as she threw the car into reverse. Damon let out a roar behind them, his body beginning to shift into a massive, terrifying form, but Nova was already flooring the accelerator. How do we handle this? She panted as they hit the road, a pack of massive shadows trailing the car in the darkness. We have contacts, Dale said, his voice tight. Just drive. An old wooden bridge came into view, spanning a deep, fast-moving river. The planks looked weathered and weak. Nova's eyes narrowed. Hold on, she shouted. She slammed her foot down as the bridge neared. The sound of snapping wood was music to her ears. In the rearview mirror, she saw the structure falling away beneath their tires. The Lycans, far too heavy for the weakened wood, were plunged into the churning water as the bridge collapsed into the river. Dale's knuckles were white as he gripped the dashboard. We could have been on that bridge. Nova let out a sharp, genuine laugh. But we weren't. She knew the current would carry the beasts downstream, buying them the time they desperately needed. By the time they reached the main highway, the shadows were gone. Nova looked at her hands on the wheel. They were steady, but the mercury light in her eyes hadn't faded. She had faced the king and survived, but as the miles stretched out toward Mexico, she knew the war for her soul was only just beginning. Chapter 17. An hour into the drive, they stopped at a gas station. The cashier looked startled by Nova's disheveled state, but she managed to offer a tired smile, attributing her appearance to the chaos of the road. Jaxon remained in a cold, deadly silence, his mood darkening as the adrenaline died down. Nova, meeting his icy stare in the rearview mirror, knew a storm was brewing. "For the love of Diana, just talk to each other," Dale muttered from the back seat, his voice thick with the strain of the night. "The tension is enough to choke on." Jackson's warning growl was low and dangerous, but Nova saw the embarrassment in his eyes. Dale was young, but he had witnessed a massacre to protect them. He had earned the right to speak. "Leave him alone," Roxy rasped, her voice still strained from the Leakin's grip. Nova noticed Roxy was healing slower than the others, a side effect of being a turned wolf rather than a born one. They eventually reached the safe house, a magnificent timber cabin tucked deep into the woods of Texas, decorated with fairy lights that gave it an eerie, serene beauty. As Nova parked, she saw the grief-stricken faces of the pack members waiting for them. Guilt gnawed at her. These people had lost brothers because of her. Inside, Jackson's authority was absolute. He dismissed the crowd and led Nova toward the forest. "I'm exhausted, Jaxon," Nova protested as they reached a clearing. Jaxon didn't argue with words. He swept her up, striding toward a hidden, silver lake nestled among the trees. Nova eventually stopped fighting, her energy spent. Her relationship with him had shifted again, from fear to a tangled mess of guilt and something she couldn't yet name. He set her down by the water's edge. In the moonlight, he looked like a sentinel of old. "You need to wash away the night," he said, his eyes scanning her pale face. "In the lake?" "It's freezing," Nova sputtered. Jaxon took a step closer, his scent of rain and musk filling her senses. He pinned her gently against the bark of a tree, his golden eyes focused on the pulse in her neck. He lifted her, and on impulse, she clung to him. He leaned in, his teeth grazing the skin of her throat in a gesture that was both a threat and a promise. "You," he rumbled against her skin, "could have died. Do you have any idea what that would do to this pack?" "To me?" Nova whispered for him to let go, and he finally set her down on the soft grass. "Am I that bad, Nova?" he asked, his voice suddenly calm. "Can you truly see nothing good in me?" Nova couldn't meet his eyes. "I've spent a year in a nightmare, Jaxon. I thought you were the monster at the center of it." "I want to change that," he said, his fingers tentative against her cheek. "Let me help you. The pain of the moon, it doesn't have to be your life." Nova stepped into the freezing water, the chill helping to ground her. Jaxon followed, the remnants of the night's trauma falling away as the water cleared the dirt and blood. "Fear," Nova said, her voice steadying. "That's the trigger for the darkness. I realized it at the diner. I was terrified of you when you found me, but now..." "And now?" "Now I'm just tired of the shadows." Jaxon moved through the water toward her, his touch gentle as he began to help her wash her hair. Nova didn't protest. She saw the genuine fear for her safety that had been in his eyes when Damon touched her. "The claim," she whispered, looking at his focus on her neck. "That's what you want?" "To seal the bond." "Always." Jackson's eyes darkened with his sacred intensity. Nova stepped closer, taking the cloth from his hand. She began to wash the remnants of the battle from his skin. His face, his chest, his shoulders. It was a start toward something new. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For the year I spent hating you." Jaxon didn't answer with words. He simply held her against his chest in the cold, silver water. For the first time in a very long time, Nova felt a calm that had nothing to do with the darkness. Chapter 18. The interior of the safe house was extraordinary. Dark oak floors met walls of deep reds and blues, the space feeling vast and almost enchanted. Jaxon cleared his throat, leaning against the banister. "I'll show you to your room," he mumbled, the dampness of their earlier swim still clinging to his hair. He seemed to feel the awkwardness as much as she did. As they walked down the long, door-lined hallway, Jaxon paused at a chestnut door. He reached out, his fingers hovering near her face as he tucked a stray curl behind her ear. "In 5 days," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious frequency, "there will be an autumn hunt. Under no circumstances are you to be outside after 8 p.m. Am I clear?" Nova opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat when she saw the gold bleeding into his eyes, a stark, primal warning. "We honor the fallen during the hunt," he explained, stepping back. "We shed our human control. We'll be animals until morning. It's for our brothers lost." Nova realized then that she wouldn't be a part of it. She nodded, the weight of the lives lost in her name pressing down on her. "One more thing," Jaxon added. "The full moon falls on that night, too. I can already smell the transition in you. I won't be able to control the wolf's instincts during the hunt. Lock your doors, Nova. Don't let anyone, especially me, in." He left her then, and Nova collapsed into a restless sleep. 2 days later, the quiet of the house was broken by Roxy's arrival with news that Nash, the doctor, and Piper had arrived. While the house remained a maze of secrets, Nova was determined to find the truth about the message Damon had left. Following a tip from Roxy, Nova spent her morning training with Nash, a sparring session that left her drenched in sweat and hyper-aware of her own emerging strength. When Nash was called away to handle pack business, Nova took her chance. She used a bobby pin to pick the lock of the top-floor office. It was exactly like Jaxon, imposing and scented with wood smoke. She searched the shelves until her hand caught on an old leather album. Tucked in the back was a crumpled piece of parchment. Nova opened it, her breath hitching as she read Damon's words. "I have taken what I wanted from her as a testament to your weakness. Consider this a countdown, Alpha. If you fail to deliver Nova to me within the month, I will dismantle your pack piece by piece until you are left with nothing but shadows. The choice is yours. King Damon." The door to the office slammed open. Jaxon stood in the archway, his expression dark with a fury that seemed to shake the very walls. Chapter 19. Jaxon gritted his teeth as the medical staff worked to stabilize Piper. The she-wolf was spiraling, her internal struggle manifesting in a surge of power that threatened the delicate monitors. It was a tragic sight. Her olive skin was pale, and the grief of losing Colt had pushed her to the very brink of her humanity. "Colt would be grateful for what you're doing," Roxy said, squeezing his hand as the sedatives finally took hold. Jaxon didn't answer. He wondered if keeping Piper in this state was an act of mercy or a refusal to let go of the last piece of his friend. "We have to finalize the hunt boundaries," Jaxon said, shaking off the fatigue. "Damon is looking for any crack in our defense." He left the infirmary, heading toward the top floor. He needed the legal isolation of the hunt grounds to be absolute. However, as he reached the landing, young Isla approached him, her eyes wide with worry. She had smelled an intruder in his private office. Jaxon's instincts flared. He didn't like breaches in his territory. He reached the office door and swung it open, prepared for a fight, only to find Nova. She was surrounded by books, with a faint mark on her temple, holding the very note he had tried to hide. The air in the room grew heavy as Jaxon stepped inside. He stood close, his presence radiating an alpha authority that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Silver light bled into his eyes as he looked at the parchment in her hand. "What are you doing here, Nova?" he asked, his voice a low vibration. "I came for the truth," she snapped, holding the note up. "You treat me like a child, but I'm the one Damon is hunting. I'm staying to solve this, not to be hidden away." The tension between them snapped. It wasn't just anger, it was a year of suppressed magnetic pull. Jaxon leaned in, his focus absolute. When their lips met, it wasn't a gentle greeting, it was a collision of frustrations and unspoken desires. For a moment, Nova responded, her pulse racing against his own, before she pulled back, her breath ragged. "Don't do that again," she whispered, her cheeks flushed. "I'm here to end this, Jaxon. Not to be claimed." A sudden, sharp ring from his desk interrupted them. Jaxon answered the phone, his blood turning to ice at the sound of the caller's voice. "Alpha Jaxon," Damon purred. A reminder of the cost of disobedience. "Check your messages." Jaxon rushed to his laptop. Nova stood beside him, her hand resting tentatively on his shoulder, a small gesture of support that calmed his inner wolf. He opened the file, and the room went silent. It was a view of the Chicago territory. The pack house was in ruins, the grounds silent. Damon hadn't just attacked. He had wiped an entire branch of Jaxon's family off the map in a single night. There were no survivors. Jaxon gripped the desk, his knuckles white. This wasn't just a threat, it was a massacre. Damon had declared total war, and the autumn hunt would no longer be a ceremony of remembrance. It would be the beginning of the end. Chapter 20. The full moon was less than 24 hours away, and the safe house felt like a pressure cooker. Nova sat on the windowsill, watching the pack prepare the backyard for the autumn hunt. From this height, the wolves looked like shadows moving with purpose. She spotted Jaxon near the tree line. He was wearing glasses, a list of the fallen in his hands, a rare, scholarly look for the alpha. He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with such intensity that Nova felt her breath hitch. He didn't move, didn't growl. He just looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in an unstable world. Nova stuck her tongue out and snapped the curtain shut, but her heart was already racing a mile a minute. By 8 p.m., the atmosphere in the forest fractured. A unified howl rose from the trees, a sound that was both a morning song and a battle cry. The bonfires were lit, their orange glow licking at the night sky. The hunt had begun. Nova lay on the floor of her room, the first tremors of the transition rippling through her. Since she was still in between, the change wasn't the fluid shift of a born wolf, it was a kaleidoscope of internal pressure. Her frame felt too small for the energy surging through her blood. Every muscle cramped, and the mercury light in her eyes began to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. "Dale," she panted, her voice already beginning to distort. "I'm here, Nova," the guard replied from behind the door. "Roxy is still on the perimeter, but the doctor is on standby." "Don't let anyone in," she gasped. But the moon had other plans. As the peak of the cycle neared, the air in the room seemed to thicken. Suddenly, the balcony door slid open with a heavy thud. Jaxon stood there. He was a vision of primal energy, his shirt torn and his eyes glowing with an ancient, predatory gold. He looked wild, a man who had spent the last hour running with the beasts, but the moment his gaze landed on Nova, the wildness focused into a singular, protective intent. "I heard you through the trees," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made the floorboards hum. Nova backed away, her skin flushed with the fever of the shift. "You have to go. You said you couldn't control the wolf." "The wolf wants to protect his own," Jaxon said, stepping into the room. As he drew closer, a strange miracle occurred. The agonizing pull on her joints began to recede. It was as if his very presence was a gravitational anchor, stilling the storm in her blood. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before finally making contact. The moment his skin touched hers, the pain vanished. It was replaced by an overwhelming, magnetic heat, a peace so profound it made her knees weak. The in-between state she had suffered for a year finally found its balance. "The bond can stabilize you, Nova," Jaxon murmured, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not here to claim a prize. I'm here to be the sanctuary you've been running from." In the quiet of the room, the barriers Nova had built over a year of running finally crumbled. She realized that she wasn't just safe because of the walls of the house, she was safe because of the man standing in front of her. She reached out, seeking the warmth she had denied herself, and for the first time, the moon was no longer a curse. They spent the hours of the hunt in that quiet equilibrium. Jaxon stayed by her side, his presence acting as a living shield against the physical toll of the cycle. "I don't think you're a monster anymore," she whispered as the first light of dawn began to touch the Texas horizon. Jaxon pulled her closer, his breathing steady. "And I don't want you to ever have to run again. We leave for India in 48 hours. We're going to find out what you are, Nova. And we're going to find a way for you to live without the shadows." Nova closed her eyes, finally falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. She was no longer a marionette of the darkness. For the first time, she was a woman choosing her own path. Chapter 21. The basement of the timber cabin felt cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and iron. Jaxon stood before the heavy steel door of the holding cell, his jaw tight. Beside him, Nash checked a tablet displaying the captive's vitals. "He's stable enough to talk, Alpha," Nash whispered. "But he's a zealot. He won't give up Damon easily." Jaxon stepped into the room. The Leakin was chained to a bolted chair, his hazel eyes flickering with a dim, defiant red light. He looked up at Jaxon and let out a dry, rasping laugh. "You're too late, Alpha," the Leakin wheezed. "The king has already tasted the frequency of her blood. He knows what she is, even if you're too blind to see it." "What is she?" Jackson's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped into the prisoner's space, his alpha aura filling the small room until the captive's breath hitched. "She is the echo," the Leakin hissed, a strange, fanatical light in his eyes. "The one the prophecy spoke of. Her blood doesn't just heal, it bridges. Damon doesn't want her for a mate. He wants her as a key. To unlock the gates our kind were meant to guard, not cross." Jaxon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement air. He remembered the shadows in Nova's blood, the smoky energy that flared when she was cornered. "If he gets her," the Leakin continued, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "there won't be a pack left to lead. There won't be a world left to hunt in. He will dismantle the balance, and she is the only thing that can stabilize the ritual." Jaxon turned and walked out, the steel door clanging shut behind him. His mind was a whirlwind. He found Nova in the kitchen, staring at a cup of tea as if it held the secrets of the universe. She looked fragile, but there was a new, hard edge to her eyes. "We're leaving for the airport in an hour," Jaxon said, his voice softer now. He didn't tell her about the echo or the ritual. Not yet. He couldn't add that weight to her soul while she was already breaking. "I heard the Leakin," Nova said, not looking up. Her hearing was sharp, sharper than it should be for someone who hadn't fully turned. "He called me a key." Jaxon sat opposite her, reaching across the table, but stopping just short of touching her hand. "He's a fanatic, Nova. He'll say anything to sow discord. But he's right about one thing," Nova said, finally meeting his silver gaze. "I'm not a wolf. And I'm not human. Whatever I am, it's the reason people are dying. If India doesn't have the answer, Jaxon, if there's no way to stop the shadows, we will find a way," Jaxon promised, his voice a sacred vow. "I didn't find you just to lose you to an ancient grudge. We're going to India, and we're going to rewrite the ending of this story." As they packed the SUV, the pack stood in a silent line, a guard of honor for their departing alpha and the woman who held their future in her veins. The drive to the private airfield was quick, the Texas landscape blurring into a mosaic of browns and oranges. Inside the jet, the hum of the engines provided a white noise that finally allowed Nova to breathe. She sat by the window, her sketchbook open, but instead of lines, she found herself tracing the reflection of the man sitting across from her. The flight to India would take 16 hours. 16 hours in a confined space with the man who claimed her soul, while a king moved his pieces across the globe to claim her blood. The war was no longer at their doorstep, they were flying right into the heart of it. Chapter 22. There was a darkness in her that snarled whenever she reached for the light. It felt threatened as she sat at the corner of her bed in the shadows. Nova had done nothing but cry and scream until a headache rang in her skull, but she didn't care. To accept his bite would mean misery. To refuse it would mean the end of her life. Yet what hope was there for her when she couldn't stay dead? He would end her life if he had to. Nova had seen it in his eyes. Even if he didn't want to, He would do it to stop her from becoming a mindless beast. Was she selfish enough to put Jaxon through that? Yes, the darkness in her hissed. You're a selfish little thing. A knock sounded on the door. Roxy entered, eyeing the room with a cautiousness that made Nova pause. Nova's nails were as sharp as claws, digging into her palms until the skin was white and bruised from the force of her own grip. She had destroyed the room in her rage. The funeral is in an hour, Roxy murmured, ignoring the broken furniture. Okay, Nova's voice cracked. She tasted the salt of her own tears on her lip. Are you going to come? Nova shrugged, watching the rain pelt against the window. Should I? They blame me anyway. I smelled the anger when they arrived. It's not your fault, Roxy said softly. Nova wondered how often they lied to her. She didn't want to be one of them. Did it hurt? The change, I mean. Yes, Roxy stated firmly. It was the worst pain I had ever experienced. But it was better than the alternative. Nova turned back to the window. She had enjoyed a normal life once, even if her ex had ruined it. She wanted that life back. She was greedy for it, but Jaxon stood in the way. His touch still burned her skin. Despite the conflict, Nova knew she wouldn't forgive herself if she didn't go. They had died protecting her. She would offer her gratitude, even if it wasn't wanted. I'll go, Nova said. The rain drenched her body as she stood under the screaming sky. Her own tears mixed with the downpour as Jaxon and several other men placed bodies on wooden pyres. They would burn them, as was the custom of the wolves. She smelled the smoke before she saw the light. The flames caught the wood like an inferno, enveloping the fallen. Jaxon remained silent as he lit each pyre, his face set in a grim line. Nova watched him, noting how his hair clung to his forehead and how his eyes had lost their shine. She realized he was a stubborn man who couldn't admit he might be wrong, yet she also saw he wasn't the monster she had first believed him to be. Nova sighed as an older woman with caramel eyes turned to glare at her. She ignored the looks and joined the line to offer a final gift. She had drawn a wolf for each of the fallen. 7 wolves howling at the moon, lit with the life they had once possessed. It wasn't much, but it was a part of her. Jaxon's hand brushed against her wrist. He noticed her staring at the flames and gently tucked a piece of wet hair behind her ear. It's not your fault, he said, pulling her into a brief, steadying embrace. That's not what they think, Nova said, her eyes reflecting the fire. They blame me, and I blame myself. Let them. You're alive, Nova. At least you're alive, he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers for a moment before stepping away. Nova stared at him in disbelief. She wondered if she was truly worth those lives. Looking at the grieving crowd, she felt she wasn't. The pack had gone on a run to celebrate the passing souls, leaving Nova alone with the cooling ash. Despite the rain having stopped, she was freezing, her body racked with shivers. She wanted to avoid the people and the pain in their eyes. A mother of one of the warriors had stopped earlier and called her a murderer. Jaxon had seen it, but the woman had vanished before he could speak. You'll catch a chill out here, Jaxon's voice rumbled behind her. I don't care, Nova replied. Jaxon walked toward her, his eyes flashing silver in the moonlight. You don't mean that. Do you mean the deaths or the girl who confessed she cared? Nova asked, tears pricking her eyes again. Jaxon reached for her, his scent of the forest wrapping around her. There is no shame in feelings, Nova. I never said there was. She stood, her knees cracking from the cold. What do you want? Come to tell me it's not my fault? Or to threaten me with the claim again? Jaxon stepped closer, the intensity of his gaze silencing her. For a heartbeat, the space between them vanished, the air thick with everything they couldn't say. Nova stepped back, a snarl revealing her teeth. Don't touch me. He eyed her with a heavy look before noticing a wolf circling the border. It was a friend, a sentry. Jaxon gestured for her to follow him, walking closely by her side as he guided her back toward the cabin. Why must you make things so difficult? He asked. All I want is. You want me to be the perfect, obedient mate, Nova snapped, stepping further away from him. Everything I'm not. You think I'm being unreasonable for not wanting this gift of breaking bones and sniffing people? Jackson's eyes turned into slits. I want you to live, Nova. I will die because I don't want to be like you, she shouted. She wanted his anger, but instead, he watched her with curious, penetrating eyes. She felt exposed. Why are you so intent on dying? He asked, stepping closer. My problem, Nova whispered, her voice hoarse, is that you're forcing me to be what I never wanted to be. I don't want your bite, and if that means death, then so be it. At least Damon will stop chasing. I'd rather they die than you, he said, his voice so faint she barely heard it. Nova bared her teeth. How can you be so selfish? To wish for your family to die over someone who doesn't even love you. What made you so scared of being loved? Jaxon asked. Nova paused. A raw wound opened in her heart as she remembered her ex, Elliot. He had been her hope, and he had destroyed her. She remembered the heartache of realizing her father didn't want her. Why would she want that pain again? Tears streamed down her cheeks. She was exhausted by the guilt and the self-hatred. Jaxon pulled her into his arms as she sobbed, and this time, she didn't fight him. I'm sorry, she muttered. It's all my fault. It's not, Jaxon rocked her against him. I'm horrible and cruel, she hiccuped. I hurt people and I don't deserve this. I love you, Nova, Jaxon said into her hair. I know you don't feel the same, but I wouldn't change you. Only because of the bond, Nova said, pulling away. You wouldn't want me without it. I could have ignored you the night we met, he said, touching her face. My soul would have let you go if I didn't want you. I want to be with you, your anger, and your problems. But I can only help if you let me in. I don't want to be a wolf, she said. We'll figure it out. We'll see what the pack in India says. There may be a way for you to stay as you are, he said, a smile tugging at his lips. You've beaten every other rule of the wolf genes so far. Nova looked at him, hope flickering. You promise you won't make me change? I can't promise it'll never be necessary if you're dying. But I promise I won't force you if there is another way. As long as you try. Try this. Us. Nova's heart ached. She wanted to be happy, but she was terrified of the potential for more pain. The darkness in her was silent now. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. If you stick to your word, I'll try. Jaxon grinned and pulled her close. A howl echoed in the distance as they walked back to the cabin. Nova dropped the cage she had placed around her heart. She hoped India would have the answers they needed, that she could remain human and finally find the peace she craved. Chapter 23. Nova hated planes. It wasn't that she was afraid of flying, but she detested being trapped in a cramped space with strangers. Her instinct was to remain on the move. It was how she had survived this long. Being suspended in the air with no escape felt suffocating. Terror had been her constant companion since they sat in the first-class cabin. Jaxon claimed it would be harder for the lichens to track them here, and maintaining the secret of their existence from the humans around them was vital. It gave Nova little comfort, but she didn't voice her concerns. She had promised to try. Jackson's arm brushed against hers as she peered out the window. Clouds meddled with purple hues and orange light as the sun rose. It was a breathtaking sight, even if the lack of solid ground made her queasy. How much is left? Nova mused. Jackson's gaze was already trained on her face, his expression soft and light. She had noticed the change since their conversation in the forest. A few hours, Jaxon murmured. Nova's breath caught as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She felt the instinct to pull away, fearing the darkness within her might resurface, but nothing happened. It was a shocking realization. What? He asked, a glint in his eyes. She had been staring. Nothing, she muttered, unable to hold his gaze. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. Instead of answering, he brushed his knuckle against her cheek and guided her head down to his chest. Uncertainty mixed with embarrassment, but she felt the steady rhythm of his heart as he stroked her hair. Nova knew she was letting herself melt into him too fast, but there was no room for darkness when she felt this at peace. Soon, he whispered in her ear. Soon you'll be safe. When Nova awoke, she was in Jaxon's arms. A hot breeze wafted around them, carrying the scent of spices, mangoes, and sweat. They were moving through thriving, busy streets. She was in India, seeking a pack that would tell them the truth about what she was becoming. Voices murmured throughout the building. Nova jolted awake on silken sheets, her skin sweaty from the warm air. She found herself in a room with a golden mosaic floor and cream marble walls. Large, glassless windows opened onto a balcony to keep the air ventilated. The cold floor was welcome when she stood. She felt well-rested but needed to wash. She padded into a lavish bathroom accented in pink and red tones. For the first time in years, her fingers itched to paint the colors she saw. Nova spent over half an hour under the cold water. She scrubbed her skin, repeating a mantra: try, get better, try harder. It was her only hope for salvation. When she finished, she wrapped herself in a fluffy white towel and returned to the room. Jaxon sat on the edge of the four-poster bed. "I see you're up." Awkwardness settled between them. Jaxon looked away, his hand rushing through his raven hair. Nova realized she was only covered by the towel. "You could have knocked," she accused. "I could have," he agreed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Can you pass me some clothes?" Nova asked. He moved to the suitcase in the corner, taking a long time to pick something out. When he finally extended the clothes, his hand brushed against her wrist. Nova caught the scent of the forest on him as he leaned closer. "You smell like yourself again," he whispered, his breath warm against her neck. "I know," Nova murmured. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the darkness within her stayed quiet. She stepped back quickly, taking the clothes and rushing to the bathroom to change before her resolve crumbled. They walked into the main sitting room together. The decor was museum quality: a deep berry-colored sofa, an intricate wooden coffee table, and a large zebra rug. The scent of exotic flowers was enticing. "I'm glad to see you two haven't ripped each other's heads off," Roxy mused from the sofa. "Indeed, I'm lucky to escape with my vitals intact," Jaxon joked. Laughter boomed from a man Nova hadn't seen before. He appeared to be in his 60s with cocoa-colored skin and golden eyes. "Alpha Jaxon, I presume," the man said, shaking hands. "I am Madhavidya, but you can call me Taya." Taya's gaze shifted to Nova. Something dark in her winced at the energy pulsing off him. The darkness that haunted her seemed afraid of this man. "You must be Nova," Taya said with a knowing glint. "The one who caused this trip. Can you help her, Taya?" Roxy asked impatiently. "It is not for me to decide," Taya replied. "The High Priestess must make that decision. It is best if you come now. We have a long trip, and we must arrive before sundown. The creatures here can be vicious." "Will we be walking?" Nova asked. "No," Taya laughed. "We'll have to run once we reach the jungle." Nova paused. How was she supposed to run through this humidity in a summer dress and sandals? "You won't be running, pumpkin," Jaxon chuckled. "The jungle is too dense for those sandals. You'll have to ride on my back once I shift." Heat flooded Nova's cheeks. "What?" I can't switch to a wolf," Nova snapped. "What am I supposed to do?" "You'll be riding my wolf," Jaxon said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. She followed him down the dusty path toward the greenery. "Don't worry, it'll be cooler in the jungle," Jaxon lied. "The jungle is even more humid, Alpha," Taya corrected. Nova followed the wolves into the dense growth. Taya began to prepare for the shift, and Nova looked away. "The trail to the pack is at the edge of the jungle, near the cliffs," Taya explained. "The difficult bit is getting there without stopping. Once you start running, you must not stop. There are creatures in this jungle older than you can imagine." Panic clouded Nova's vision. "You mean the jungle will try to kill us?" "You'll be safe, Nova," Roxy promised. Taya's body began to morph gray first sprouted until a large wolf with golden eyes stood in his place. Roxy followed, her transition swift. Jaxon stood next to Nova, ready for the shift. "I need to tell you something," he murmured. "We only let those close to us touch our wolves. Riding a wolf is an act of deep trust. For a mate, it's a sign of acceptance." Nova's breath shuddered. "Maybe I should ride on Roxy's back?" "She has a mate. Her instincts would protect her space fiercely," Jaxon said, taking a step closer. You will ride with me. It's the only way. Nova understood the gravity of the bond he was describing. She had come to accept her attraction to him. Okay, she whispered. I understand. Jaxon's form began to blur and expand, the human giving way to the primal as a massive black wolf with golden eyes took his place. He nudged her hand with a wet nose. Nova gripped the scruff of his neck and hauled her leg over his back. The powerful muscles shifted beneath her as he lowered himself. Roxy and Taya set off into the deep jungle. Nova held on tightly as Jaxon began to run toward the answers they so desperately needed. Chapter 24. The moment they passed the invisible barrier in the jungle, Nova felt her chest constrict. An overbearing force attacked her. Her head felt as if it were being crushed, her ribs felt ready to crack, and blood began trickling from her nose. Nova hid her face in the scruff of Jaxon's neck. His powerful body jostled her as he ran at a speed she didn't think possible. Worried whimpers escaped his snout, and from the corner of her eye, she saw Roxy's wolf giving them equally anxious looks. But Nova didn't let go. She held on even when her arms felt like they would fail, through the dark green roots and tree stumps that seemed to rise up to surprise them. Taya led them as if he had the jungle memorized, navigating a path that seemed to shift and change. A groan of pain escaped her when Jaxon skidded beneath a low branch. He let out a warning growl, nipping at Taya's tail. Nova drifted into a forced slumber, the rippling of the wolf's muscles beneath her acting as a lullaby. It was a mercy. She couldn't have endured the pressure the jungle forced upon her much longer. She was clearly unwelcome here. Without Jaxon's protection, the beasts of this kingdom would have surely attacked. She suspected it was because of whatever lingered beneath her skin, nestled between her bones. Her eyes snapped open when something hit Jaxon's side. They tumbled to the ground, Nova writhing as the very air of the jungle seemed to suffocate her. Stars danced in her vision. Nearby, Roxy and Taya fought off a beast with horns and thick, leathered skin, a creature out of mythology. Jaxon shifted and blinked down at her. Nova smiled through the pain, blood trickling down her temple. He lifted her up, carrying her with careful strength. Hold on, Nova, his voice shook. We're almost there. Something was licking her face. Nova groaned and scrubbed at the moisture, frowning as she opened her eyes to find Jaxon's black wolf watching her. You are disgusting, she croaked. Wolfish amusement flickered in his eyes. He allowed himself to be carefree in a way she hadn't seen before. The sound of shifting bones followed, and shortly after, Jaxon stood over her. He had hastily pulled on a pair of discarded trousers, but his chest was still bare and radiating heat. Nova found it hard to look away. You had me worried, Jaxon said, reaching for her. Why? Nova asked, then remembered her previous brush with death. Never mind. The air was humid and heavy. Where am I? Nova asked, ignoring Jaxon's attempts to keep her on the bed. The large hut was made of mud and sticks, looking sturdier than any building in New York. Nova gazed at the alpha, realizing that her passion for art was returning. She felt a deep urge to capture the textures and colors of this ancient place. You were attacked by the jungle, Jaxon explained, smoothing her hair. Roxy and Taya fought the beast off while I brought you here. The High Priestess healed you. Thank you, she whispered, for looking after me. I'll always look after you, he replied. An elderly woman with long gray hair and an ebony complexion entered the hut, radiating an unmistakable aura of power. Look what you are doing to my patient, she snapped at Jaxon. She's supposed to be resting. Jaxon sputtered, his cheeks turning red. I stopped her from getting up. I bet that's what you wanted, the woman said, narrowing her eyes. Not even mated, and here you are fussing like a pup. Taya entered the room, looking sheepish with cookie crumbs on his shirt. The woman, Zola, turned her wrath on him for not keeping Jaxon busy. Nova, dear, Zola said, her gaze softening. I don't blame you. You must be confused. This brute didn't explain anything before he started fretting. She handed Nova a coconut bowl containing a pungent liquid. Drink for your energy. Nova swallowed the liquid with a grimace. My name is Zola, I am the High Priestess, she said. You're the one who can help me? Nova asked. Yes, but tomorrow. It is late, and we do not discuss such business at night. You must rest. Zola ordered Taya to show the guests to their hut. Jaxon grabbed Nova's hand, his skin warm. Outside, rain hammered down, and the jungle held an eerie gloom. Pack members moved between huts, their work continuing despite the storm. I apologize for the greeting, Taya said as they walked. Normally, there would be a celebration, but the beast that attacked us is seen as a bad omen. What was that beast? Nova asked. A horned guardian of the jungle. They sense when something is other, Taya said, looking at Nova. That is when they attack. And it's dead? Jaxon asked. It cannot be killed. It has protected the jungle for eons, Taya clarified. They reached their hut. Inside was a large wooden bed with silk sheets and a wooden bathtub. Taya departed with a friendly nod. The room felt small, filled with Jaxon's scent. Nova knew she had to stop running from him. He had saved her and protected her, and she had accepted that he held a part of her heart. Why did you cut your hair? He murmured, touching a strand. It made it easier when I was on the run, Nova said. I liked it long, Jaxon whispered, his gaze softening. But you look beautiful either way. I'm just glad you're here. He leaned against the bedpost, his touch electrifying. Nova, he whispered. All I can think about is how much I almost lost you. Nova didn't pull away. She leaned in and met his lips. A soft sound escaped him as he held her. This was what she had been denying herself for a year. Jaxon lay her on the bed, his forehead resting against hers as he looked into her eyes. Tell me to stop if this is too much, he murmured. I don't want to stop, Nova replied. She pulled him closer, showing him through her actions that she was no longer running. As they moved together, the rest of the world, the jungle, the beasts, and the looming threat of the Lichen King simply ceased to exist. In the quiet of the hut, they finally found the connection they had both been starving for, lost in the heat of a shared promise. They stayed together until morning. Nova watched him sleep, realizing she would do whatever was necessary to protect him and the pack. She would face the monster within her to stop the Lichen King. Chapter 25. Sun danced across her eyelids as a yawn escaped her mouth. She heard the sound of running water in the distance, her ears twitching with recognition of Jaxon's humming. When Nova opened her eyes, she saw the alpha by the large wooden tub, his bare back to her as he prepared the water. She stretched lazily, noting the slight ache in her muscles. For the first time in a year, she felt satisfied and at peace. The constant tension of being on the run had finally ebbed away. It was almost surreal. You look like a cat when you do that, Jaxon stated, leaning against the tub with a smirk. Nova sat up, blinking away the sleep. I feel like a cat. As if you could sleep for 18 hours a day? Jaxon raised an eyebrow, his eyes bright with a rare, relaxed warmth. Nova hummed in response. Shivers traveled over her skin as she stood, her stomach grumbling for food. The meal Zola had left had been forgotten the moment they were alone the night before. Heat trailed up her cheeks at the memory of their closeness. As if he could sense her thoughts, a slow, knowing grin spread over his face. Come here, Jaxon said softly. Nova stepped freely into his arms, sighing in comfort. She pushed away the lingering guilt, trying to enjoy the blissful peace for as long as it lasted. Without warning, Jaxon picked her up and stepped into the heated water. The shock of the heat was followed by deep relaxation. His chest vibrated with a silent chuckle as he kneaded her shoulders. Just like their time at the small lake, Jaxon washed her hair, massaging her scalp until she was completely relaxed. They sat in the quiet of the morning, the steam rising around them. Nova focused on the steady beat of his heart against her back, savoring the feeling of being protected and cherished. Clean and refreshed, Nova eventually stepped out of the bath. Jaxon watched her with a soft, protective gaze as she wrapped a cloth around herself. Before a word could be exchanged, there was a sharp knock on the door. It slammed open. Roxy stood there, disheveled. You have to come. There was no teasing in her voice. Immediately, Nova became wary. What is it? Jaxon grunted, his protective instincts snapping back into place. Zola has called an emergency meeting. The beasts, Roxy clarified, they're gathering around the borders because they sense something. They sense Nova. Nova swallowed hard and looked at Jaxon. His mind was already turning toward strategy. How many are there? More than they can manage, Roxy said. We have to get Nova to Zola now. This is our only shot before we have to leave. Nova gave a brief nod. She knew she needed to gain her full strength to stop Damon. If she didn't, Jaxon would die. It was an inkling deep inside her that filled her with fear. She had learned to always trust her gut. The tribe was in an uproar. Nervous energy filled the area, making Nova's stomach flutter. People looked at her with curiosity, fear, and pity. She tried to stay positive. Taya was waiting outside a large tent. He glanced at the fence in the distance with worry. Come, we're ready for you. They entered a darkened hut filled with the smell of sage and eucalyptus. Nova saw a large stone table where Zola stood, her eyes closed. There was a pale white aura around the old woman that seemed to vanish whenever Nova focused on it. When Nova approached, the High Priestess's eyes opened. They were completely white. Jaxon studied Nova as she recoiled in surprise. She is in a trance. Lie down, Taya urged. Nova lay on the cool stone, her head swimming. Zola began to speak in an ancient language. As the priestess wafted incense over her, Nova began to feel sleepy. Her mind resisted, but Taya's hands were warm on her head, urging her to let go. The room filled with a quiet buzz. When Nova opened her eyes again, she was in a dark hallway illuminated by torches. Hello, she called. Her voice bounced off the stone. She felt a sudden urge to follow a sound in the distance. At the end of the tunnel, she stepped through iron doors into a chamber of white marble and gold. 3 beautiful people were gathered around a glass table, 2 men and a woman. One of the men looked exactly like her father. Papa, she whispered, but he didn't react. Do you have it? The woman asked, her voice ice cold. The other man extended a silk-wrapped box. I always give the highest service. Nova felt her chest constrict as her father opened the box to reveal a glittering heart. It was the essence of a soul. As Nova reached out, her fingers skimmed the heart, and a memory flashed through her head. It was her life before she was mortal. She saw a meadow under a midnight sky filled with beings like her, demon sprites. The memory morphed. She saw the man with brown hair trapping her in a box while she was distracted by flowers. The other sprites watched, knowing they couldn't stop it. She was yanked back by the woman's laugh. Her father's face was grim. The image faded, and Nova found herself in that same meadow from the memory. Hundreds of sprites danced around her. It's beautiful, isn't it? A voice asked. Nova spun around to see a man with dark hair and pale skin. His eyes glowed green like the meadow. Don't you know where you are, Nova? I forgot that you are part mortal now. You knew me? Nova asked. What am I? The man sighed and took her hand. Instantly, they were in a dark castle with a stone throne. My name is Hades, and I am the king of the underworld. You made the lichens, Nova blurted. I used to rule them, Hades said, a frown overtaking his face, before Damon stopped listening. Hades explained that her father, a demon named Julian, fell in love with a mortal woman instead of completing a dark pact. Your mother, Hades said. He was so enthralled he forgot his promise. Your mother became pregnant. And then she died, Nova whispered. You're not to blame, Hades said. The men you ran from were sent to correct the betrayal. They killed your father, but you escaped. And Jaxon? Hades chuckled. The wolf gene Jaxon gave you is what kept your humanity. The darkness in you, the demon side, fights the wolf because it fears it. That is why you feel such rage. Nova looked at him. How do I stop it? If the Alpha claims you, you will share his soul. If I take the demon part away, then you would live as a wolf. I'll do it, Nova said. There must be a price, Hades warned. Damon is dangerous. If he is not eliminated, the mortal world will suffer. You must be the one to kill him. Alone. Yes. Jaxon cannot know. Damon is powerful. If he senses a plan, he will strike. Jaxon must claim you first, and you must survive your first shift before you face him. Nova licked her lips. What happens if I fail? You won't, Hades said, taking her hand. It is time to return. Before she could ask more, Nova was back in her body, and the god was gone. Chapter 26. As soon as Nova opened her eyes, she barely had enough time to register her surroundings before a wave of intense nausea hit her. She collapsed forward, gasping for air. Jaxon was by her side in an instant, muttering words of reassurance that she didn't quite register. Nova felt the prickling stares of others around them as Zola took a step back to take in her appearance. It was then that she felt it. The darkness pooling around her and latching onto every negative feeling inside her. There was a roar somewhere in the distance, and the tribe became quiet, hushed as if they were afraid to move. Nova pushed herself away from Jaxon's arms, her feet unsteady as she stood. She couldn't bring herself to meet their eyes, knowing what they would see, the darkness her father had been a part of. Knowing the truth was painful, more so than she had imagined. How was she supposed to tell this to Jaxon and his pack? How was she supposed to face them when they were protectors and she was the other? The thought was suffocating. Jaxon gripped her wrist before she could leave. Nova caught his wide eyes and shrugged out of his touch. She needed to get out of there, somewhere where no one would watch her as she crumbled. Her chest felt constricted as she made her way through the crowd, ignoring Taya's knowing eyes. Her feet took her to the very edge of the village, where a small creek was wedged between the large fence that separated the jungle from the pack. Her reflection was startling. Her eyes looked deeper, shadowed by dark, spiderweb-like veins marring her cheeks. Her skin took on an unnaturally pale tone, but it was the aura around her that made her terrifying, dark and wild like static, untamable and dangerous. The sobs started the moment she collapsed onto the ground. They shook her body until she could do nothing but let them pass. The realization that her father had known all along what she was, and that he had eventually turned away from her because of it, was like a stab to the chest. Nova curled into herself, shielding her face from the wind. Nova knew now what she needed to do. She would be the one to stop Damon. But it was the way she'd have to go about it that made it hard to breathe. Jaxon would be heartbroken, and there was nothing she could do except hope that when the time came, he would understand. To let him mark her and then to leave would feel like an utter betrayal. But there was no way around it. Hades had made that clear. Jaxon watched as Nova walked away with a heaviness on her shoulders. His body urged him to chase after her, but the part of him that had gotten to know her understood that she needed space to process. The memory of the way darkness had wrapped around her in the trance was unsettling, making his wolf skittish. Zola met his eyes, her face marked with exhaustion. "Do not push her, Alpha. Give her time." Jaxon sighed but nodded. He ran a hand through his hair and watched as the pack members huddled closer to each other. It was a defense mechanism. There was strength in numbers, and right now, they could sense chaos in the air. After an hour had passed, Jaxon followed the scent Nova had left behind. As soon as he stepped outside the hut, he was intercepted by Roxy. "Jaxon," she warned. There was fear in his sister's voice. "She won't hurt me," he replied firmly. "She may not want to, but you know she doesn't understand that presence yet." Jaxon went a step around her. Roxy's arm shot out to block him. A loud growl vibrated from his chest, the dominance of his alpha wolf surfacing to demand the path. "Stand down," he snapped. Roxy's expression remained fierce for a moment before her gaze wavered. "I'm worried for you, brother." Jaxon calmed his energy. He understood her concern. "I can handle myself. Help Taya guard the gates. We won't be staying here much longer." He found Nova by the creek. She spun around with her defenses high, her eyes dark with a wild, primal energy. Jaxon leveled his gaze with her, crouching down to show he wasn't a threat. Jaxon let his wolf shine through his eyes, offering a steady, calming presence. Nova's posture slowly softened, the darkness in her gaze retreating as her eyes shifted back to green. Jaxon approached, reaching out to pull her into a silent, steady embrace. Nova rested her head on his shoulder and finally let out the last of her tears. It took a long time for her to explain what she had learned about her father, her nature, and Damon's thirst for her power. Jaxon listened, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. Her origins didn't change the woman he had come to know. "I love you," he finally murmured. He didn't care if she was ready to say it back. He just wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Nova stiffened. "You know that I can't say that yet." Jaxon hummed, brushing a thumb over her cheek. "I will wait as long as it takes. I'm just grateful that you're here and that you told me." She shifted, looking away. A flash of unease crossed her features, and he suspected she hadn't told him every detail of the bargain, but he attributed it to the stress of the vision. "Is there something more?" Jaxon asked. Nova met his eyes. "The jungle," she murmured. "I can sense the beasts lurking. They're getting closer." Jaxon nodded, accepting the answer for now. He brushed a kiss on her forehead and stood, extending his hand. "Then let's get ready. We leave soon." Chapter 27. They were escorted from the tribe as soon as the sun rose the next day. Zola's farewell embrace had been bone-crushing, and Nova felt a slight pang of sadness as they left. Surprisingly, they met no resistance outside the borders. Nova still felt creatures lurking in the shadows, but she sensed they were simply ensuring their exit. A day later, they arrived at the airport in Houston, where Nash was waiting. Nova breathed in the cool air, feeling a sense of relief. Despite the lichens and the threats following her, America was her home. "What has you so worked up, Nova?" Jaxon asked. His eyes were tired, and his hair was unkempt, but his smile still took her breath away. "Just the thought of a long shower when we get back," Nova replied. The task Hades had assigned her weighed heavily on her mind, but she was starting to build a strategy. She would do whatever was necessary to keep them safe. Over the next week, they settled into a routine. Jaxon and Nash handled pack business, while Nova focused on training with Roxy. They had been back for 8 days without a sign of Damon. His silence made Nova more nervous than his presence ever had. Later that afternoon, a disagreement over how to handle Piper, whose wolf remained in distress, left Nova feeling raw and angry. She needed air. She yanked open the front door, stepping onto the porch. There, a medium-sized pink box with a white rose caught her eye. She scanned the yard, but it was empty under the tight security. She sniffed the air, detecting a faint, metallic scent and the unmistakable smell of Old Spice. She tore off the lid. Inside was no note, only Elliot's blood-stained engagement ring and a lock of his blonde hair. The message from Damon was clear: no one from her past was safe. Nova forced herself to remain calm, though her heart felt like it was breaking. She took the box straight to Jackson's office. One look at her face, and the scent of the box had him pulling her inside and locking the door. Nova collapsed into sobs. Even if Elliot had betrayed her, he didn't deserve this. "I'd rather it be anyone but you," Jaxon said firmly, trying to comfort her. "Anyone? How can you be so selfish?" Nova demanded, her grief turning into rage. "I won't watch people die for me." "I have waited years for you," Jaxon snapped back, his alpha nature surfacing. "I would do anything to make sure you stay safe. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, so be it." Nova retreated to her room, her mind a whirlwind of anger and fear. At midnight, she stepped into the backyard to seek the silence of the woods. "You shouldn't be out here," Jackson's voice came from the shadows. He approached her, his presence a constant, grounding force that calmed the darkness within her. "I don't like you being in danger," he whispered. "You are everything to me." He kissed her, and the anger she felt finally deflated, replaced by a deep, undeniable need for the connection she had been fighting. He pulled her close, and in that moment, the choice was made. As they stood under the moonlight, Jackson's strength enveloped her. He leaned in, and his teeth grazed the skin of her neck. Nova gasped as a surge of energy, hot and transformative, spread through her veins. Something snapped into place. The world shifted. The otherness she had felt her whole life was suddenly anchored by his soul. The bond was sealed. Jaxon held her close as the weight of the connection settled over them. Nova felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion, but for the first time, the darkness inside her was quiet, quelled by the Alpha's mark. "Sleep, Nova," he murmured, carrying her back to the house. As she drifted off, she saw visions of red eyes and a satisfied deity. The path was set. By morning, the marking was complete, and Nova knew there was no turning back. Chapter 28. Confusion clouded her thoughts. It wasn't often that she woke up with her memory frazzled, but on this particular morning, Nova couldn't quite pinpoint what had caused her this pounding headache. She blinked back the sleep, groaning at a dull ache that spread through her shoulder and neck. Nova sat up, her head spinning. It was as if she were looking through a new pair of eyes. Everything looked crisp and clean. The world had more shapes and colors than she had ever noticed before. It was a heightened sense of reality that felt entirely foreign. She glanced around the room. Jaxon was nowhere to be seen. Nova frowned at her increased sense of smell. She could pick up the scent of pine and rain from the woods outside, even through the closed window. Her memory blurred until she gasped, covering the side of her neck. It pulsed with a strange flow of energy, vibrant and warm. She found herself in the bathroom within seconds, looking at the mark on her neck. It was a distinct, swirling pattern, a claim. A seal to their bond and a sign that she was his mate. It felt primal, yet there was a deep sense of belonging inside her. Her fingertips brushed across the skin, a wince crossing her face. Nova sensed him before he appeared. Jaxon met her eyes through the mirror. Despite the tension in his body, his eyes looked the clearest they had for weeks. They were calm, like a sky just after a storm. "Do you hate it?" Jackson's voice startled her. It wasn't a standard injury. It was a symbol of a shift that would change everything. The full moon was in less than 2 weeks, and she already sensed a change within herself. The darkness seemed to have retreated to the farthest corner of her mind, shrinking away from the new life force flowing through her. Nova released a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "No," she said. "But I am afraid of what it means." "I'll be there," he offered with a tentative smile. "I'll always be there." Finally, he approached her, resting his forehead against hers. The following days passed in a blur. Nova spent as much time with her mate as possible. It was addicting, the way his presence made her feel. But it was terrifying all the same. Nova realized she didn't want to leave. For a year, she had been on the run, and now she felt hollow whenever he wasn't near. Nash and Roxy doubled her training. With sightings of lichens across the country and the threat from Damon looming, they were adamant about preparing her. She needed all the strength she could get to survive the upcoming shift. There was no telling if the demon side of her would fight back. With the increased senses came unfortunate accidents. Nova no longer knew her own strength. Several door handles had been bent because she pulled too hard, and multiple phones had to be replaced. Jaxon was patient, even proud, but she saw the underlying concern in his eyes. Nova knew she wouldn't be a normal wolf. She was faster than Nash and could easily keep up with Jaxon. Her body seemed to move with the shadows themselves. She watched her appearance change. Her skin became clear, her eyes brightened like emeralds, and her hair grew rapidly. The pack members stayed clear of her, wary of the raw power she now radiated. As the full moon neared, she had an increasing sense that someone was watching her. Not in a physical form, but in a way that teased her brain. None of the other wolves picked up on the shifts in energy, but it was enough to keep her on edge. Less than a week before the full moon, Jaxon received the news they dreaded. Damon had attacked again. "How many are injured?" Jaxon snarled into the phone, the veins in his arms bulging. Jaxon had been hoping for an alliance, but the other alpha seemed hesitant. He cursed, slamming the phone onto the desk. Nova approached him tentatively, placing a hand on his back. He turned quickly and pulled her into his arms, seeking the comfort of their bond. When Jaxon looked up, his eyes were sad. Nova knew the alliance had failed. "There will be others," she murmured. "They're just afraid." "We're all afraid," Jaxon snapped. "All the more reason why we should be joining forces." Jackson's eyes softened as they fell to her neck. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "Now that I've claimed you, My instincts are just loud. I want to protect you from everything. Nova's guilt rose each day, knowing she would eventually have to face Damon alone. After Jaxon had fallen asleep, Nova snuck outside. It was reckless, but she needed answers. She crept toward the forest, heading for the lake. She knelt in the cold soil, picturing a road forming between herself and the deity who had spoken to her. She called out Hattie's name in her mind. "I need your help," she spoke silently. "I need to know how to ensure Damon doesn't win." For a long time, there was no response. Nova stood to return to the cabin, frustrated by the silence. As she turned, she thought she saw a fleeting sight of red eyes in the darkness. They were gone in a heartbeat, but the feeling of being watched remained until she was safely back in the house. Chapter 29. Damon, the king of the lichens, was furious. He paced in front of the large marble fireplace, his hands tightened into fists. The crown that he usually displayed proudly on his head was smashed on the other side of the room, fragments of the dark metal scattered across the floor like shards of glass. "Tell me that you are joking," Damon snarled, his temper rising by the minute. "Tell me that this is some pathetic ruse." His hand, tipped with lethal, supernatural claws, swiped against the mantelpiece. The heavy stone cracked and fell to the ground under his strength. Rocco hovered in the corner of the room, his eyes cautious. Damon enjoyed the taste of fear that leaked from his beta. He enjoyed the way the resistance in his subordinate's eyes reminded him that he was the only one who truly mattered. He was the king. "I'm afraid that what I speak is true, Your Highness." Rocco's voice was barely a murmur, a quiet buzz in Damon's ear. It enraged him all the same. "How? Tell me how she has agreed to be with him." He spat the words out with disdain. "I planted the seed. I used every influence to make her turn away from that alpha." Damon paused, his mind racing. If his previous attempts to manipulate her mind had failed, perhaps another route was necessary. But he shook his head, discarding the thought immediately. It was clear that no one was fit for the task. They had proven it time and time again. Rocco's face was contorted in discomfort. "I'm afraid that this was the work of a more powerful being, Your Highness." Damon stopped his pacing, his eyes shooting toward Rocco's trembling face. Anger simmered in his veins at the mere thought of being undermined. In the blink of an eye, he moved with unnatural speed, pinning Rocco against the stone wall by his collar. Damon's red eyes narrowed into glowing slits. "Are you suggesting I am lacking beta?" The words came out in a low, dangerous hiss. Rocco shook his head submissively, gasping for air against the weight of Damon's presence. "No, not compared to anyone living," he wheezed. Damon paused, his head twisted to the side in thought. "Living, you say?" he mused. That could only mean one person who would dare interfere, an ancient force he had discarded long ago. "Hattie's." He shoved Rocco aside before resuming his pacing. Of course, the king of the underworld would interfere, if not through his own shadows, then through Nova herself. It infuriated him that another would meddle with his interests, his Nova. And to let that young alpha claim her, his lips curled back to reveal sharp, predatory teeth. From now on, he'd have to work alone. It was clear that everyone else was simply too impressionable. Damon would have Nova no matter what it took, even if he had to tear through everything in his path to get her. Chapter 30. Nova stood by the window, watching the moon climb higher into the sky. It was nearly full, a glowing orb that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as her own heart. The house was quiet, but the air was thick with the scent of pine and the underlying musk of the pack. Jaxon entered the room, his footsteps silent. He didn't speak, simply wrapping his arms around her from behind. His heat was a constant comfort, a tether to the world she was quickly outgrowing. "I was thinking about Elliot today," Nova murmured, leaning back into him. Jaxon stiffened slightly, his grip tightening. "Why?" "Because he was part of a life that feels like a dream now," she said, turning in his arms. He was safe. Boring, but safe. And now I'm standing here waiting to turn into a monster so I can kill a king. "You aren't a monster, Nova," Jaxon whispered, his eyes searching hers. "You're a force of nature. And you aren't doing this alone." She didn't tell him about the price Hattie's had set. She couldn't. Instead, she pulled him into a kiss that tasted of desperation and a burgeoning, primal hunger. As the clock struck 11, the shift began. It started as a searing burn in her marrow. Nova collapsed to the floor, her breath hitching as her ribs began to crack and reform. Jaxon was there, his voice a low, steady rumble in her ear, guiding her through the agony. "Let it happen, Nova. Don't fight the wolf. Give her the lead." She screamed, but the sound morphed into a guttural howl. Her vision fractured, colors bleeding together until the world was a map of heat and scent. Her claws tore through the floorboards as her spine elongated. The darkness Hades had nurtured met the wolf gene Jaxon had given her, and for a terrifying moment, they fought for dominance. Then, the snap of the final bone signaled the end. Nova stood on 4 powerful legs, her fur the color of a midnight storm. She was larger than a standard wolf, her eyes glowing with an emerald intensity that hummed with ancient power. Beside her, a massive black wolf watched with pride. Jaxon nipped at her ear, a playful challenge. Nova snarled, her dominance surfacing instinctively, but he didn't back down. He nudged her toward the open door, leading her into the cool night air. They ran. The forest was a blur of silver and shadow. Nova felt the earth beneath her paws, the vibration of the hunt calling to her. Jaxon veered off, returning minutes later with a rabbit clamped in his jaws. He dropped the prize at her feet, a silent offering of care. Nova hesitated, her human mind recoiling for a split second before the wolf took over. She accepted the meal, the act a natural part of the cycle they now shared. Jaxon waited patiently until she was finished before hunting his own share. When their bellies were full, and the sky began to turn purple with the approaching dawn, Jaxon did something that caught her by surprise. His head bowed low to the ground, his neck exposed in a sign of absolute trust and respect. Nova felt the shift in their bond. He wasn't just her alpha, he was her partner. Her beast honored his gesture with a bow of her own, her forehead pressing against his. That night, they became equals. The mark on her neck hummed, the connection now indestructible. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Nova knew the time for hiding was over. The wolf was awake, and she was ready for the king. Chapter 31. The next day was bittersweet. Nova tried to hide her sadness and the anxiety that pushed through as she ran with the pack for the first time. Her time was limited now, and she knew there was no point in procrastinating. If she didn't leave soon, Damon would come for her. After Hades had appeared in her dream, it had become clear that she already sensed a dark presence around her, the glowing eyes and the prickling sensation of being watched from the shadows. Before they went to bed, Nova pulled Jaxon into a small gazebo hidden among trees at the back of the cabin. Ivy grew over it, sheltering them from the cold. Surrounded by the scent of the forest, Nova didn't waste time. She pulled him close, her touch feverish and eager, trying to memorize every detail of him. They were both alphas now. There was a primal instinct within her to stay, to mark him as her own and never look back. But she knew that would only make it harder to do what was necessary. As they held each other, Nova could only focus on the love that filled her chest whenever she met his eyes. Still, she kept those thoughts to herself, a silent goodbye hidden in every touch. Days began to blur as she held off on leaving. A large part of her soul couldn't bring itself to go. This was her pack now, and her beast wanted to stay and protect those it cared about. But the longer she stayed, the more dangerous it became. Hades began to assault her dreams with silent warnings. Nova knew she was being selfish, yet she clung to a false sense of security. On the day that the trees were finally barren, another wave of sadness hit. The tribe in India had been attacked. Taya was gone, and Zola was left heartbroken. It was a warning, a message intended for her. Damon would have her, and if she stayed, Jaxon would be the one to pay the price. Her hands shook as she held the pen. The only advantage of her soul being part demon was the fact that shadows seemed to become her. She was practically invisible to the most heightened senses. Nova flickered her gaze to Jaxon's sleeping form. His chest rose and fell with the deep rhythm of sleep, his features finally relaxed. Nova's breath shuddered as she moved quietly to his side. Her heart felt as if it were breaking. It wasn't fair that she had to do this alone, but to keep her pack safe, she had no choice. Her lips brushed tenderly across his cheek before she left the folded note on the side table. She took nothing but the clothes she wore. She would let her beast take over once she was far enough away, running wherever her instinct took her. Nova released an agonized breath the moment the cold air hit her. She didn't look back, the shadows blending her into the night as she walked further away from her mate. Deep within the forest, she finally gave in to the change. The transformation took hold of her, her human form giving way to the powerful black wolf within as she discarded her human self. Without a backward glance, she raced away from home. As she hit the pack borders, a pain-filled howl sounded in the distance. Nova could only grit her teeth and race toward a confrontation that could end everything. Jaxon stirred awake in the middle of the night, a fleeting dream lingering behind his eyelids. His nostrils flared, seeking the scent of his mate. He reached out to hold her, but his hand met only cold, empty sheets. Worry clouded his mind. Nova couldn't have left him, not after everything. Then his eyes zeroed in on the folded parchment on the bedside table. It was laced heavily with her scent. Fear turned his bones to lead as, with shaking hands, he flipped the paper open. "I'm sorry that I must do this, but Damon has to be stopped, and I am the only one who can do it. Please forgive me. I leave you my heart, Nova." A snarl ripped out of his throat. His wolf surged forward, the transformation exploding from within him as the shift burst through his chest. His roar echoed throughout the entire territory. She was gone. Nash burst through the door, his eyes frantic. He saw the letter and the Alpha's beast, his expression turning to one of pure shock. But Jaxon had no fight left in him. His hackles died down, replaced by low mourning whimpers. Nash scanned the paper. She's gone to kill him. She's gone to kill Damon. Jaxon's beast howled into the night, his heart heavy with grief. He knew the truth. No one walked away from the Lycan King alone. Chapter 32. A dull numbness had spread through Nova, bearing down on her senses as she struggled to distance her mind from Jaxon. Every rich, woodsy scent that clung to her skin reminded her of what she had left behind. She took a sip of the black coffee. She had traveled mindlessly over the past few days, barely stopping to rest. She needed the muddled sense of a crowd to hide her trail. After a few days of running, she had managed to find a change of clothes that served as a meager disguise. From the corner of her eye, she noted a group of men watching her. She ignored them, waiting for the real predators. It didn't take long. A citrus scent filled her nose as a blonde male reached her table, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up for a different reason. She said she's not interested. The voice was low and dangerous. Nova snapped her eyes to the newcomer. The human male who had been bothering her winced at the ferocious intensity in the stranger's eyes. Even humans could sense the predator behind the skin. The blonde man stammered an apology and fled. Nova met the Lycan's eyes. He had dark brown hair and a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Her trap had worked. "It's been a while," she murmured, trying to appear nonchalant. "You're drawing attention," the Lycan Rocco replied. He slid into the booth with a lethal grace. "I admit, you have tested my king's patience. Your alpha has undoubtedly paid a heavy price for holding on to you." Nova held back a snarl. "I want to clear some things first. If I go with you, Jaxon's pack will be left alone." Rocco gave a firm nod. "Your mate lives. For now. Come on then. We've wasted enough time." Nova followed him out to a black Mercedes with tinted windows. She sensed 3 other Lycans inside. As she slid into the seat, a strange, sweet-smelling mist filled the car, or perhaps it was a localized spell. Before she could react, the world turned to shadow. Nova woke with a throbbing headache as light pierced her eyelids. "Hello to you, too, princess," Rocco drawled from the front seat. "A bit dramatic, don't you think?" Nova snapped, trying to shake off the dizziness. She was an alpha female, yet the raw power of the Lycans was unnerving. Within minutes, A magnificent palace loomed ahead, with marble towers, stained glass, and exotic gardens. They were clearly no longer in America. Rocco escorted her inside, where she sensed dozens of guards. Every instinct urged her to run, but she knew her mission. They reached a room in one of the towers. It was elegant, but served as a gilded cage. Deep brown floors, navy walls, and ivory decor. "His Majesty will see you when he is ready," Rocco said, locking the door behind him. Exhaustion took over. Nova found a simple silken robe in the closet and wrapped it tightly around herself, collapsing onto the soft bed. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep until a shift in the air pressure woke her. She tried to move, but a heavy arm was draped across her waist, keeping her in place. Her eyes snapped open. Damon was lying next to her, propped up on his elbow with a smirk of absolute delight. "Good afternoon, Nova. Welcome to my palace. I'm so glad you finally decided to join us." Chapter 33. Nova was out of bed before he could blink, her face contorted into a silent snarl. Lying next to a male that wasn't her own sent the beast beneath her skin on edge. It crawled at the back of her mind, hackles raised as Damon merely laughed. "I forgot how sensitive you wolves are." He cocked his head to the side. "Or should I call you my little demoness?" Her lips curled back to reveal her sharp teeth, but she did not answer. She would have to play it smart. It was her job. A task set by the gods. "I'd prefer Nova," she grunted out. But that would imply that you're nothing more than an ordinary wolf. And I can't have my people thinking that about my bride, can I?" Damon tooted, the smile on his face widening into a grin. Nova's insides froze at his words. Bride. The urge to laugh threatened to overpower her, but she stifled it. "I don't remember a proposal. Is that what you want?" Damon's eyes lit up. "I can make that happen, my precious. I can go down onto my knees and ask for your hand, with the sky blanketed in stars. Is that what you want?" He was unstable. Nova eyed him warily as he took a predatory step forward. There was no denying he was striking, but there was a lack of sanity or empathy in his gaze. She could see why Hades had made him king, even if she now had to fix that mistake. "I wasn't aware I was your bride," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "I came here because I wanted to be by your side." The anger dimmed, and the smile returned to his face. "You did." Damon stepped toward her, caging her against the wall with his massive frame. His presence was suffocating. He mistook her stillness for desire as a groan escaped him. Nova held her breath as he pulled her closer. "You smell like him," he growled. "You smell like that young alpha." Panic threatened to wedge itself in her throat. "But I am here with you," she soothed. "I am your king," he hissed, his red eyes narrowing into glowing slits as he gripped her shoulders firmly, pinning her to the stone. "Do not interrupt me when I speak. Am I clear?" She ached to rip his throat out, but she had to play the part. She willed her body to relax, nodding in compliance. Damon released her, moving away with an indifferent smile. "I'll pour you a bath. A seamstress will come and check that your gown fits. I picked it out for you." "Extend your arm, Miss Lulu," the seamstress ordered. The party was scheduled for 8 p.m., and Damon had ordered her to be presented as a trophy. Nova knew what this would look like to Jaxon. The dress was extravagant, blood-red lace that emphasized her frame. They curled her hair, letting it flow down to cover the mark on her neck per Damon's request. "Please be careful around His Majesty," Lulu whispered, clipping a diamond necklace around Nova's neck. "Pretend you like him. That is all he wants. The king is a collector, and you are his most valuable prize." The doors to the balcony opened. Fairy lights were draped through the trees like twinkling stars. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at her. Nova took a hesitant step forward. Nausea built within her, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Take the stairs to your left," a voice echoed in her head. Nova recognized Hades immediately. She complied, her red gown swishing as she descended. The crowd watched in silence as she reached Damon's side. There was a predatory glint in his eyes. Nova forced a fake smile, appearing docile. Damon extended a hand toward her. "Take it," Hades hissed in her mind. Nova held her breath at the coldness of his skin. She let her smile grow, playing the part of the blushing bride. "Nova, my bride and your future queen," Damon's voice boomed. Cheers erupted, and camera lights flashed. Nova smiled as Damon pulled her to his side, his hand resting possessively on her waist. Disgust rolled through her, but the voice of God kept her rooted in place. Soon, it would end. As Nova descends into the garden, she is entering a world of high society lichens who blend into the human world of politics and royalty. To better visualize the scale of Damon's influence. Chapter 34. A film of depression had settled over Jaxon, making the world appear gray and hollow. Every breath felt like a chore, every heartbeat a reminder of the void Nova had left behind. He spent his days pacing the perimeter of the territory, his wolf howling at the moon until his throat was raw. Each time his heart rose to his throat, and he had to hold back the urge to retch from the sheer weight of his anxiety. "She's doing what she has to do," Nash said, leaning against the doorframe of Jaxon's office. "You know, Nova. She wouldn't have left if there was any other way." She went to him. "Nash," Jaxon snarled, his eyes flashing a dangerous amber. "She went to that tyrant alone. Do you have any idea what he'll do to her?" "I know what she'll do to him," Nash countered, his voice steady. "She's an alpha now, Jaxon. And she's more than just a wolf. You felt it. The darkness, the power." Damon has no idea what's coming for him. But Jaxon couldn't find comfort in words. He needed action. He needed an army. 2 days later, Jaxon stood at the border of the Northern Territory. He didn't wait for an invitation. He shifted, his massive black wolf tearing through the underbrush, and let out a roar that shook the very trees. Within minutes, he was surrounded by Northern sentinels, their hackles raised. He shifted back, standing naked and unashamed in the clearing. "Tell Lorenz I'm here. And tell him I'm not leaving until we talk." The standoff lasted for hours until Lorenz himself appeared. The Northern Alpha looked exhausted, his usual polished exterior replaced by dark circles and a weary slump to his shoulders. He didn't shift, he simply gestured for Jaxon to follow him to a small stone cottage near the main house. Inside, the atmosphere was unexpectedly domestic. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of Earl Grey tea filled the air. Amelia, Lorenz's mate, sat on the sofa, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. "You look like hell, Jaxon," Lorenz said, handing him a pink bathrobe. "Put that on. You're scaring the pups." Jaxon scowled but complied, wrapping the plush fabric around his frame and sitting down with a cup of tea. The absurdity of the moment wasn't lost on him, but his desperation outweighed his pride. "Damon has her," Jaxon said, his voice cracking. "He took her to his palace. If we don't move now, he'll break her. Or he'll use her to break the rest of us." Lorenz sighed, glancing at Amelia. "My pack is tired, Jaxon. We've been fighting skirmishes on our borders for months. If I commit to a full-scale assault on the palace, I risk everything." "If you don't," Amelia interrupted, her voice ringing with authority, "there won't be a pack left to protect. Damon won't stop with Nova. He wants the world, Lorenz. And he'll start with the alphas who refuse to bow." She stood, walking over to Jaxon and placing a hand on his shoulder. The Luna energy she radiated was calming, a maternal strength that seemed to steady Jackson's frantic heart. "Nova saved me once," she whispered. "She saved this family. We aren't going to let her face that monster alone." Lorenz looked at his mate, the conflict in his eyes slowly turning into resolve. He stood, extending a hand to Jaxon. "I have 300 fighters ready to move. We'll need to coordinate with the southern packs and whatever's left of the Eastern Alliance." "Nash is already reaching out," Jaxon said, gripping Lorenz's hand. "We move in 3 days. Then we finish this before I give birth," Amelia said with a sharp, determined smile. For the first time since Nova had left, Jaxon felt a spark of hope. It was a faint, flickering thing, but it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. He looked at the tea in his hand and then at the powerful alpha across from him. The tide was shifting. The hunter was about to become the prey. Chapter 35. It was a week after the announcement that Nova saw Damon again. The palace hallways felt surreal as she observed the grand preparations from a distance. She had established a rigid routine to cope, waking late, spending an hour in the massive bathtub, avoiding the oils Damon had selected, and walking the grounds. Occasionally, she let her wolf out for a small trot, but she was forbidden from entering the forest. Rocco had confronted her at the tree line days prior. "You only have 3 weeks to prepare," he had warned, his eyes filled with veiled contempt for his king, "before you sign your life away." One evening, as the sun set in hues of pink and purple, a shadow fell across her. Damon stood there, looking like a magazine model, but his presence felt empty and predatory. "I wouldn't have come to you if I wanted you dead, my king," Nova lied, following Hattie's silent instruction to appear docile. Damon led her to a lavish dinner. Later, on the balcony, he revealed a dark history. He spoke of his first mate, Layla, who he claimed was lost to the darkness of his own making. Nova realized his true weakness. He was profoundly lonely, a collector who broke the things he loved. "You and I are more alike than you think," Damon murmured, pressing her against the railing. "You're as much of a monster as I am." He leaned in, his voice a low hiss. He claimed she was the queen of their chess game, but that he was the one to say checkmate. In a blur of supernatural speed, Damon placed his hand over her heart. A wave of dark, ancient magic surged through her. Nova felt her soul being suppressed, her body turning cold as a magical stasis took hold. Her last thoughts were of Jaxon's gray eyes before the world went black. Damon felt a fleeting inkling of remorse as he stared at Nova's motionless form. She reminded him of Layla. But he reasoned it was for the best. Her defiance was a weakness he could not allow. "What have you done?" Rocco snarled, entering the quarters. "I have claimed her silence," Damon replied, shattering his glass against the wall. He threatened Rocco's own mate, Lulu, to ensure his compliance. "The wedding is still on," Damon announced, lifting Nova's unconscious, magically bound body. "There's just no room for her rebellion now. The ceremony will take place tomorrow night." He brushed a stray hair from her forehead, satisfied that she was finally his, locked in a sleep from which only he could wake her. No one would ever take her away again. Chapter 36. He wasn't sure exactly when it happened. The pain encompassed his entire body, a searing fire spreading through his veins and down his torso. Nova. Jaxon knew then, even as a raw, broken sound left his mouth. His hand clutched his chest as Nash and the other alphas gathered around him, shouting frantic instructions and commands. The truth was written in his very soul. The bond had gone silent. She was gone, torn away from his life, as if the connection had never existed. A crushing numbness followed the agony. Jaxon counted every second, knowing with a hollow certainty that he could have watched his world fall apart and still not felt this much devastation. Perhaps he had been wrong about mates all along. They were not just a gift from the gods. They were a tether, and once cut, they left you drifting in a void. There was no doubt in his mind that Damon was responsible. As he lay helplessly in the barracks of their camp, the only flickering thought he could hold on to was the hope that Nova had given the king a fight, that she had gone down with the fire he loved so much. Even then, the bond flickered with a phantom light, and all Jaxon could do was close his eyes, desperate to escape the waking nightmare. His dreams were immediately filled with her haunting voice and the lingering, sweet scent of rain and musk. Nova was truly gone, and as Jaxon looked at the stars, he felt the heavy, suffocating weight of a future that no longer had a purpose. Chapter 37. Nash's hand shook as he twisted the dial on the radio, waiting for it to finally catch a signal. Static taunted his already tense mind. Nova's silence was a shock to his system. No one had truly believed Damon would risk the woman he claimed to want. Clearly, they had underestimated his obsession. Nash sighed, massaging his aching temples as Alpha Lorenz entered his line of vision. Lorenz offered a flask of water, which Nash refused. The camps were stationed, Warriors waiting for a signal, and Nash needed a clear head. "Is Jaxon going to be okay?" Lorenz asked. Nash moved away, still searching for a signal. "Would you be?" If Amelia's bond went silent. Lorenz took a deep breath. "Clearly, we can't save her now, but we can still hold Damon accountable. He broke every sacred law. King or not." Nash knew he had to lead. With the beta gone, he was next in command, but he needed his alpha back. He wasn't even sure if Jaxon knew the full extent of Nova's resilience. He headed toward the barracks. Jaxon lay motionless, his breathing shallow and ragged. He had been restrained for his own protection, as his grief-stricken wolf had nearly leveled the barracks in its fury. "Jaxon," Nash barked, standing over him. "We don't have time." "I don't care," Jaxon croaked, eyes glazed with pain. "The connection is gone." "Maybe it is just suppressed," Nash countered. "Damon doesn't know what we know. We can use his ignorance to our advantage." Jackson's silver eyes flashed with a spark of awareness. "If you are lying to me." Nash held up the key to the restraints. "The killing blow belongs to you, Jaxon. You suffered the loss. You are the one who wipes him from the earth." Suddenly, a loud, thunder-like crack echoed through the forest. A wave of dark power hit the camp like a physical weight. Nash braced for an attack as the shadows materialized into a man in leather boots, a Leakin. "I haven't got much time." The Leakin's voice was distant, sounding more like an echo than a man. His eyes landed on Jaxon. "Alpha Jaxon." Nash moved to shield his alpha. Lorenz stepped forward, his wolf snarling. "What do you want?" "You are outnumbered." "I have not come to fight," the Leakin drawled. "I come bearing news about Nova." Damon's rage has led him to a dark decision. He has cast a binding spell over her, a stasis that mimics the end, and now he plans to complete a ritual of eternal possession at midnight. Jaxon dropped to his knees, his voice cracking. "Where is she?" "In the palace." He is unstable. He thinks that by binding her soul while she is in this state, he can keep her forever. Jaxon snarled, his canines lengthening. "Why are you telling us this?" "He has lost his mind," the Leakin snapped. "Some of us detest his rule and will aid you. Others will fight for him. This is your only chance to get inside the palace while he is distracted by his own dark ceremony." Jaxon stood, his alpha dominance returning through the grief. "I am not leaving her with that monster. I am marching in." "Then have a plan," the Leakin warned, looking into the shadows with panic. "East wall. Midnight." With that, the intruder and the shadows vanished. Chapter 38. The night turned chilly the moment the Leakin messenger disappeared back into the shadows. Jaxon barely registered Nash's hand on his shoulder as the warriors shifted back, all looking at him with expectation. Even Lorenz looked prepared to follow his command. Jaxon swallowed the pain. There was an emptiness inside of him now, a place where emotion had been replaced by the primal instinct to protect his pack and reclaim his mate. He struggled to rein in the wolf, holding on to the hope that the connection could be restored. He met Nash's steely gaze. "Assemble the warriors. We march at dawn." "And the pack?" Nash whispered. Jaxon paused, refusing to dwell on the possibility of not returning. "I'll call Roxy. I need you to make arrangements, in case the battle takes everything from us." Alpha Lorenz stepped forward. "Amelia will have my head if I leave you to face this alone. We're in." Jaxon ventured to the outskirts of the forest to find his signal. He dialed Roxy. Her voice was the only normalcy he had left. "We leave at dawn, Roxy," he said, his voice heavy. "Prepare the pack. Strengthen the patrols, but keep them calm. I may not come back. Strengthen the line of succession. Be safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jaxon looked up at the stars one last time. At dawn, the warriors shifted. The tension was heavy as Jaxon led his men toward the enemy's palace. For a future without Damon, they would fight. Jaxon lifted his muzzle to the sky and let out a long, haunting howl. Nova was a haunting sight, lying upon a ceremonial dais draped in silk. She wore a blood-red lace dress, her form still and cold under the magical stasis. Lulu stood over her, hands trembling, a sight that satisfied Damon. He fed on the fear. "Make her appearance striking," he commanded. Lulu gave a terrified nod. Damon smirked, his eyes trailing over Nova's features. Finally, he believed she was his. He dismissed the seamstress, watching her flee with a spark of dark amusement. "My beloved," he murmured, brushing a curl from her forehead. He hummed an old tune, a melody from a childhood he had long since outgrown. To him, she was not just a mate, she was his salvation, the key to proving the ancient forces wrong. The doors slammed open. Rocco entered, his expression dark and tense. Damon mocked him, knowing Rocco was bound by an old blood oath. "Guests are arriving. You're expected in 20 minutes, Rocco drawled, his jaw clenched. Damon reined in his temper, smoothing his white suit. "Fine. I shall make my way." Damon took a moment to compose himself. He made his entrance into the ballroom, where hundreds of eyes stared at him, filled with a mixture of terror and forced admiration. He stepped onto the dais, his eyes glowing with a predatory light. "Let the feast begin," he declared as the crowd cheered. For hours remained until the ritual at midnight. Chapter 39. The silence was eerie, reminiscent of the meadow Nova had entered during the ritual in India. She floated on the brink of lucidity, unsure if she was trapped in her own subconscious or the abyss of the afterlife. She struggled to remember his name, yet a part of her feared that more memories would only lead to more pain. Smoldering silver eyes danced in the dark of her mind, a temptation pulling her toward a steep slope away from her humanity. She realized that now, unlike the other times she had died, she had a choice: return to the surface to breathe and remember, or let go and float into the universe. Her inner beast prowled under her skin, alert to this new, strange perspective. "Where do I go?" she asked the void. "Anywhere you wish," it answered. "Where should I go?" "There where there is love and laughter," a whisper responded. "My little sprite," a familiar voice drawled. In an instant, she was back in the throne room. Hades sat atop his throne, a crown of bones floating above his head. "Why am I here?" Nova muttered. "You're dead, are you not?" Hades sauntered over, a smirk on his face. "You have a knack for getting in trouble. Trouble I put you into, granted, but you've done your job splendidly." "Damon's not dead," Nova retorted, the memories slamming back into her. She still avoided thinking of those silver eyes. "Not yet," Hades said. "Once you awaken. You should know by now that you cannot stay dead." "Don't I have a choice?" Nova asked, looking toward the looming windows. "Every time I come back, I go wrong. I become evil." "Evil is not the word for you," Hades countered. "You come out different because you leave a part of yourself lingering here each time. You see the shadows, the threads that connect the worlds. You could stay, but you would be missing a part of yourself. And now that you have an anchor in the living world, being separated would be agony." He took her hands and turned them palms up. With a snap of his fingers, a thornless, blood-red rose appeared, shimmering as if made of glitter. A gift. A different sort of anchor. It will be the glue for the bits of you that stayed here and the bits that return. Why a rose? Because even beautiful things cause pain. You're that rose, Nova. Hades leaned in and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a kiss of affection, but a bolt of magic. Fire spread through her chest, sinking into her marrow. Nova gasped, tearing away. The rose was gone from his hand, but it was now ingrained between her breasts, a shimmering tattoo that moved with the rhythm of her heartbeat. "Safe journey," Hades whispered. Nova was slammed back into her body. Her eyes snapped open, and the first word she gasped into the stale air of the room was his name. Jaxon. Chapter 40. It took them 6 hours to reach Damon's territory. 6 hours of nonstop running, only stopping for the occasional sip of water. Jaxon led the charge, his heart heavy with the cost of the coming battle. He tried not to think about the deaths that hung over their heads. He could see it in the eyes of his warriors, the fear for those they had left behind. Stationing the warriors was no easy task. It was pure luck that the wind blew south, away from the palace and the keen noses of the lichens, and that the heavy rain masked their scents. Droplets of water trickled down Jaxon's back, coating his black fur until it was slick. The palace was surrounded by a massive stone gate that curved like a fortress. Jaxon had stationed his men carefully, relying on a Lichen defector's intel that the front gates would be less guarded. Several more hours passed until the clock tower struck 11:30 p.m. At the signal, Jaxon's wolf released a battle howl, hundreds following in his wake. The sound reverberated through the forest, stilling everything inside the palace walls. Jaxon tore through the front gates, his wolf snarling for the king. Jaxon's name left her lips the moment her consciousness returned. It tasted pure in her mouth, a sharp contrast to the strange, heavy energy that now sat in her bones. She was clad in the blood-red dress, its lacy detail a mocking reminder of Damon's obsession. Ice spread through her veins as her senses returned. She could hear a party in the distance and, faintly, Damon's laughter. Her top lip curled to reveal her canines. The beast inside her wanted justice. The woman wanted to make him pay. Nova edged off the surface where he had laid her, her gaze falling on the ornate glass vessel he had intended to keep her in. The sheer arrogance of the man. To treat her like a trophy to be displayed in a tomb. The shadows in the corner of her eyes shifted and molded, clinging to her body with an almost sentient excitement, the price for her rebirth. "He's coming," the shadows seemed to whisper. Nova snapped her head toward the double doors. "Hide," Hattie's voice echoed in her mind. She didn't have time to process the new tattoo of magic on her chest. On instinct, Nova lunged toward the height of the ceiling. She realized then that she could become the shadow itself, blending into the dark corners of the world. The tendrils of darkness smoothed over her skin as she scaled the wall. She smelled it then, Damon's tangy, sharp scent. The doors opened, and his voice came to a halt. "A vessel," someone in the crowd murmured, confused. Nova stifled her rage as she pushed herself farther into the dark. Outside, a chorus of howls erupted, echoing through the palace. Panic swept through the guests. Damon smashed through a chair in a fit of rage, his eyes locked on the doors. The moment he turned his back, Nova dropped to the ground with a quiet, taunting thud. Damon whirled around, claws extended. But the moment the shadows peeled away from her skin, revealing her pitch-black eyes and the dark veins that marked her power, his face went slack. "Nova?" Disbelief laced his words. She stepped forward with a snarl of her own, her body trembling with the power she had finally embraced. A smirk tugged at her mouth as she inhaled the scent of his sudden fear. "Hello, Damon," she purred, her teeth glinting in the candlelight. "You didn't think I'd miss my own wedding, did you?" Chapter 41. Blood coated his tongue as Jaxon moved through the first wave of lichens. The surprise of the attack was the only advantage his men had. His eyes were zeroed in on the entrance to the palace, several hundred yards away. Already, Damon's beasts were pouring out of every entryway, jumping from windows onto the battlefield. Jaxon let the beast take over, the pull of the bond guiding him into the maze of the Lichen kingdom. "You're meant to be gone," Damon snarled. He was hesitant, his eyes wild as he took in Nova's defensive crouch and bared teeth. "Clearly, I'm not," Nova replied with a lethal grin. She needed to rile him up. Blind rage would make him careless. "Hattie says hi." Damon lunged. Nova's body spun in midair, landing several feet behind him. A blazing fire burned through her veins, the power of the sprite and the wolf combined. "What are you?" he breathed. "I am your end, Damon." Nova moved like a shadow, flickering in and out of his sight. Her claws nicked his cheek, and for every life he had taken, she made him feel the weight of his crimes. They met claw to claw, the air thick with the scent of ozone and ancient magic. Damon slammed her back into the stone wall, his red eyes glowing with a desperate fury. "I should have turned you to ash," he hissed. With a heavy grunt, Nova kicked his legs from beneath him. As if the conflict had awakened the magic in her skin, the rose on her chest glowed with a blinding heat. Shadows twirled around her arms, tightening around Damon like iron bands. Whatever magic wove into her skin prevented him from shifting. "Please," Damon gasped, the weight of his defeat finally sinking in. "You deserve this," Nova whispered. "Let him go," Rocco's voice cut through the air. The Lycan stood nearby, a sword in his hand. "Let the wolves have him, Nova. Let his end be a testament to the new law." Before she could reply, the doors splintered as Jaxon's wolf charged through. In a moment of chaos, Jaxon lunged at Rocco, perceiving him as a threat. The distraction was all Damon needed. He struck out, and Nova felt the connection to her mate fracture. The pain was like a physical collapse of her lungs. "And oh," she cried out. All rational thought vanished. Nova shifted into a beast coated in moving shadows, fur as black as the abyss. She landed on Damon's chest, her claws glowing with a dark, spiritual light. She did not make the same mistake twice. With a final surge of magic, she severed the life force keeping the king tethered to the world. Damon fell, his expression frozen in shock. The war was over. Nova collapsed by Jaxon's side, her hands trembling as she touched his pale cheek. The silence of the bond was a deafening weight. "Alpha," Nash's voice murmured in her ear, pulling her away. "Nova, you cannot break now. They need to see him defeated." Days passed in a blur of grief and shifting power. The Lycan War had ended, and the crown had passed to her. She was no longer a decoration, she was a queen. Dressed in a black regal gown with silver lacing, Nova stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the thousands who had gathered to pledge their allegiance. Below her, on a ceremonial dais of gold and wood, Jaxon lay in a place of honor. "Damon is dead." Nova's voice rang over the crowd. "By the law of the moon and the shadows, the crown is mine. I swear to rule with heart, not with a fist. We are one now, Lycans and wolves alike." A crack split the air. Shadows spilled over the dais as Hades himself stepped into the light. The crowd dropped to their knees in a wave of silence. "My little sprite," the god smiled. "You made an honorable sacrifice. I reward those who serve me well. What is it that you want?" Hope, fierce and burning, flared in Nova's chest. "I want Jaxon." Hades' eyes softened. "There is a price to pay for such a gift, a price even I do not know. It will not be for me to decide what you must give in return. Are you prepared?" "I am," Nova said firmly. "Then the gift is yours." Hades placed a glowing thread of silver into Jaxon's chest. Light exploded like 1,000 stars. When it cleared, Hades was gone. On the dais, Jaxon's chest moved with the steady, rhythmic rise of a breath. The beating of his heart was the only music Nova needed to hear. She collapsed to her knees, the weight of the victory and the return finally breaking her into tears of joy. Chapter 42. Days blurred past as the renewal of the palace continued. Nova spent her time balancing the paperwork of her new kingdom and the needs of their pack back in the States. Jaxon remained in a deep, healing sleep. Every night, she lay beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, a sound she had once feared she would never hear again. Shortly after her victory, Nova had to address the world. She carefully crafted a story for the public, protecting the secret of the Lycans while explaining the sudden shift in power. To the reporters, she was a grieving bride who had stepped up to lead. She let them believe the lie to keep the peace. A week later, she found a moment to breathe in the palace gardens. As she painted, a shadow fell over her. "I didn't realize you were an artist," Rocco drawled, appearing from the maze of willow trees. "There are many things you don't know about me," Nova replied, keeping her guard up. Since the battle, they had maintained a silent truce, but his presence still made her skin prickle. Rocco stepped closer, his expression darkening. "I warned you not to make a deal with my brother. Hades does not care for the rules of others, Nova. By striking that bargain to save your mate, you have invited his influence into your life." He gestured to the shimmering rose tattoo on her chest. "Tread carefully. He has a hold on you now." Before she could retort, Nash's voice broke the tension. "Nova, he's awake. Jaxon is awake." Nova didn't wait. She ignored Rocco's lingering warnings and raced back to the palace. When she opened the doors to her chambers, the sight took her breath away. Jaxon was sitting at the edge of the bed, his back to her, watching the sunset. As she stepped inside, he turned. He looked tired, with dark circles under his silver eyes, but he was alive. He was here. Nova knelt before him, the weight of the last year finally crashing down. Jaxon reached out immediately, pulling her into his arms. He stroked her hair, murmuring quiet words of love as she finally let the tears fall. "I love you," she whispered into his chest. "I have loved you for a long time." Jaxon's breath hitched. He took her hands in his, kissing her fingertips with a reverence that made her heart soar. "I knew," he rasped softly. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you. Even though I was difficult? Even though I ran?" Especially then, he smiled, the familiar mischievous glint returning to his eyes. Nova searched his face, seeing the alpha who had chased her across the world not to cage her, but to stand beside her. "I'm sorry you got hurt, Jaxon. I felt the moment you fell, and I thought I had lost everything." "You saved us all, Nova," Jaxon said fiercely. "I thought it was my job to protect you, but you became your own savior. You're an alpha in your own right, and I couldn't be more proud to stand by your side." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "We are equals," she murmured. "In every sense," he agreed. The air between them was charged with a deep, undeniable connection. Jaxon leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that spoke of survival, relief, and a future they had fought to earn. As their bond intensified, the otherness Nova had felt for so long finally settled. She leaned into him, letting her own beast rise to meet his. With a deep, spiritual click, the bond between them snapped into place, fully formed and unbreakable. The claim was mutual, a sign of their absolute devotion to one another. In the quiet of the room, with the fire crackling in the hearth, they stayed tangled together. Every worry about Damon, Hades, and the price of their bargain faded into the background. For the first time in her life, Nova wasn't running. She was home. Epilogue. Peace had once been a strange concept to Nova, complex, unreachable, and strange in its making. But for the first time, she felt as if she had finally arrived in a quiet nest of joy and hope. Of course, the crown required her attention. Protests had spread among those opposed to the unity of lichens and wolves, but Nova traveled to each territory, making promises of a better tomorrow. Most were too intimidated by her power to argue. She was the queen of shadows and the wolf alike. One evening, Nova found Jaxon on the balcony. He was quiet, the external threat of Damon gone, but a silent weight remained between them. She reached out, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Pumpkin," he murmured, relaxing instantly. "Nash told me that when you were a little boy, you pretended to be a prince on a white horse," Nova said softly, seeking the man she loved behind the stoic alpha mask. Jaxon turned, a tentative smile reaching his eyes. "Did he now? And did he mention that he always wanted to play the princess?" Nova laughed, the tension breaking. Jaxon stepped closer, his hand reaching into his pocket to produce a small velvet box. He revealed a delicate diamond ring that captured the moonlight. "Love is a force more powerful than any other," Jaxon began, his voice thick with emotion. "Pumpkin, will you marry me?" "Yes," Nova breathed. 1,000 times, yes. The news of their engagement brought a wave of hope to the Pax. Preparations for the royal wedding began immediately, led by Roxy and Lulu. But amid the joy, Nova felt physically off, a strange sickness she couldn't ignore. Lulu paused during a dress fitting, her eyes meeting Nova's. "Nova, have you considered that this isn't stress? It would explain why you've been so exhausted." Days later, Nova found Jaxon in the library. She placed a small plastic stick on top of his maps. Jackson's breath hitched as he looked at the 2 pink lines. "A baby?" he whispered, his voice cracking with joy. "We're going to have a baby?" He let out a shout of triumph, enveloping her in his arms. The news acted as the final cement for the newfound peace between their peoples. By summer, the two were married in the garden alcove under a glittering sun. The following night, they held a grand ball. Jaxon stood before the guests, raising a glass to his mate and his future. "I have loved you from the moment I laid eyes on you," he declared. And I will until my last breath. The room erupted in applause, but the joy was cut short by a sudden, chilling roar of thunder. The crowd parted as a fissure of shimmering dark energy opened in the center of the ballroom. Hades stepped into the light, his expression grim. "The debt," Nova said, stepping in front of Jaxon. "What do you want?" "I do not control the laws of the universe," Nova, Hades said, his voice echoing with ancient power. "A life was gifted, and the balance must be restored. It is not a life I require, but a successor." His eyes landed on Nova's stomach. "Upon your daughter's 21st birthday, she will take her place in the underworld. She will live as a princess of the shadows, a bridge between our worlds. You will be granted 1 day a year to visit her. That is the price for the life I return to you." Jaxon snarled, his alpha dominance surging. "Over my dead body." "It is her destiny, Alpha," Hades said calmly. He looked at Nova one last time. "I will see you when it is time. Until then, my little sprite." With a snap of his fingers, the god vanished, leaving the ballroom in a cold, shattering silence. Their victory had come with a high cost, and though they had found peace, the shadows were already waiting for the next generation.